Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I decided to stop sleeping because my insomnia was driving me insane. I'd spent too many nights staring at the ceiling, listening to my own heartbeat, and counting the seconds until morning. No medication helped. No advice from friends did anything. I felt stranded in my own head. So one Monday night I came up with a plan. I was going to force myself to stay awake for as long as I could. I wanted to see what my mind would do when it crossed every normal boundary of rest. I didn't have any big scientific background, but I kept a notepad next to me. I planned to record everything I felt and experienced. I thought it might help me figure out what was wrong. At first it felt like a weird little experiment, but it turned into something that still makes my stomach tighten whenever I think about it. On the first day, I felt restless. I was used to sleepless nights, so missing one night didn't change much. My eyes felt a bit sore, and my legs felt stiff. I tried to keep myself occupied. I wrote a few notes in my notepad. Slight headache, no appetite, eyes itchy. I remember glancing at the clock every hour, expecting to crash at some point, but I never did. My body felt tired, but my mind wouldn't power down. I drank coffee until I felt a dull pain in my abdomen. I paced around my apartment because sitting made my legs tingle. I watched some late-night shows on my phone. Nothing unusual happened. I just felt the same old exhaustion. On the second day, my body started to complain. My eyes burned and my hands trembled. My stomach felt cramped. I drank more coffee, but it made my heart race. My concentration dipped. I noticed I had to read the same sentence 3 or 4 times to make sense of it. I tried to cook a simple meal. I remember staring at the pot on the stove and forgetting why I'd walked into the kitchen. My mind felt like it was short-circuiting. Still, I didn't see or hear anything strange. I just felt that constant prickling sensation in my arms and a dull ache behind my eyes. By the time I reached the third day, I started to regret my plan. My eyelids felt so heavy that I had to hold them open with my fingertips a few times. My limbs felt weak. My mouth tasted bitter. I kept feeling waves of nausea, but I pushed through. I told myself I could manage one more day. Around midnight on that third night, I was sitting on the edge of my bed, tapping my foot on the floor, trying to keep myself alert. I started to notice something odd in the corner of the room. It was like a shadow, but it had a shape that felt out of place. I thought I saw movement. I turned my head and it was gone. At first, I assumed it was just a trick of the light. I had one small lamp on the nightstand, and sometimes it cast weird shapes on the walls, so I shrugged it off. An hour later, I saw it again. It was a dark form near the closet. It seemed to move, but only when I wasn't looking right at it. When I focused on it, it stayed still. I felt a chill on the back of my neck. My heart started to thump harder. I remember swallowing, and my throat felt dry. I asked myself if I was hallucinating. I knew extreme sleep deprivation could cause visual distortions. I tried to shake it off. I wrote in my notepad, "Seeing shadows in corners. Probably just tired." I splashed cold water on my face in the bathroom. My reflection looked gaunt and there were dark circles under my eyes. My hair was messy and my lips looked cracked. I kept blinking, hoping the stinging in my eyes would stop. When I walked back into the bedroom, I felt a slight sense of unease. It felt like the air in the room had changed. It was heavier. My chest felt tight. I didn't see any shadows though, so I tried to distract myself by scrolling through social media on my phone. My hand shook so much that I kept dropping the phone on my lap. Sometime around 3 a.m., I saw movement again. This time it was in the corner by the window. It appeared to be a silhouette, like a person standing still but not solid. My heart hammered. I forced myself to look right at it. The shape faded. That's when I felt a sudden drop in the pit of my stomach. It didn't just vanish the way a normal shadow might. It seemed to shrink and disappear. I remember feeling sweat on my forehead. My breathing was shallow. I kept telling myself that it was an illusion. It had to be. I tried to stand up and prove to myself that I was just scaring myself. But my legs felt shaky and I almost tripped. I sat back down. My hands were clammy. My body felt cold, even though the room wasn't cold. I glanced at the closet door. I felt certain that if I looked long enough, I'd see another silhouette. Part of me wanted to see it because I was angry that my own mind was playing tricks. Another part of me wanted to ignore it. I started to wonder if something else was in there with me. I'd never believed in ghosts or spirits, but lack of sleep messes with logic. My heart was pounding and I was barely breathing. When morning light finally seeped through the blinds, I felt a little calmer. The shadows in my apartment looked normal again. I didn't see any silhouettes while the sun was up. I felt drained, though. My head throbbed, and I couldn't stop yawning. My jaw ached from clenching my teeth. Still, I told myself that I'd keep going. I wanted to reach a point where I had some kind of breakthrough. I thought that if I pushed further, I'd either collapse or find a solution. On the fourth night, I started hearing faint sounds. I was in the living room lying on the couch with all the lights off. I figured total darkness might help me relax. Instead, it made me more alert. I kept hearing soft clicking noises. At first, I thought it was the air conditioner or the pipes in the walls. Then I realized it sounded closer, like it was right behind me. I'd snap my head around and the noise would stop. I got up and paced from the living room to the bedroom, then back again. Every time I moved to a different spot, I heard that faint clicking. My throat was tight and I noticed my sweat had a strange odor. My shirt felt damp around my collar and under my arms. I tried recording a voice note on my phone to document what was happening. My voice sounded strained and I could hear how shaky my breathing was. I spoke in short sentences. Day 4, hearing noises, seeing shadows, need rest. I noticed I was slurring my words. Then in the middle of recording, I saw a silhouette near the front door. I froze. It stayed there. It looked tall and motionless, but I had the impression it was watching me. My phone slipped out of my hand. My stomach churned. I wanted to step closer, but I was scared I might provoke something, even though I kept telling myself it wasn't real. It vanished when I blinked. I walked over to the door and turned on the hallway light. I didn't see anything. My chest felt heavy and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I tried to drink some water. My mouth was so dry that the water felt harsh against my throat. I scribbled a quick note. Saw silhouette by door. Not sure if hallucination. I dropped my pen and left the notepad on the floor. That fourth night stretched on forever. I heard what sounded like soft footsteps on the carpet. I checked the entire apartment. There was nobody there. My front door was locked. Every time I returned to the living room, I saw those shapes in the corners. They were always at the edge of my vision. Whenever I turned my head, they disappeared. My heart was racing so fast I felt lightheaded. I tried to calm myself by breathing slowly, but I couldn't maintain a steady rhythm. My thoughts were scattered. I felt a stinging sensation in my eyes, and I noticed that my ears were ringing. I opened the window for some fresh air, but the outside world looked hazy. The next morning, I realized I'd managed to lie down for about an hour, but it didn't feel like real sleep. It was more like passing out for a moment. My head pounded. My limbs felt numb. I could hardly keep my eyes open. I dragged myself to the kitchen and made instant oatmeal. It tasted like cardboard. I forced a few spoonfuls down to keep my energy up. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wall, trying to process everything. My notepad was nearby, and I saw my handwritten entries. They were messy. Some lines trailed off mid-sentence. Others were just random words. It was clear I was losing my grip on basic tasks. That fifth night, I wanted to quit. My body was at its limit. My face felt hot, and my vision blurred whenever I moved too quickly. But a stubborn part of me kept whispering that I'd come this far. I forced myself to stay awake, thinking maybe one more night would push me over some edge that would explain why I could never sleep like a normal person. Around midnight, The silhouettes got bolder. I saw at least 3 distinct shapes near the bedroom door and in the hallway. They seemed to shift when I moved. They never stayed in one place for long. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck each time I noticed one of them. The room smelled stale, and I realized I hadn't opened the windows in a while. My breathing was shallow, and my heart felt like it was skipping beats. I moved to the couch, hugging a pillow to my chest. My skin tingled with every small noise. The faint clicking had returned, and I thought I heard a soft scraping sound. It reminded me of nails on a hard surface. I pressed my back against the cushions, trying to stay calm. I could hear my pulse throbbing in my ears. I glanced over at the lamp on the side table. I wanted to turn it on, but I was terrified of what I might see if the room was fully lit. My eyes darted around the living room. I kept thinking I saw movement behind the chair or near the bookshelf. Everything felt oppressive. At around 3 a.m., I stood up to check the bathroom. I heard what sounded like a shuffle behind me. I spun around, but I was alone. I noticed my entire body was shaking, and I felt cold despite the sweat on my skin. My throat was tight and my knees were weak. I gripped the bathroom sink and turned on the faucet. The water felt icy. I splashed it on my face. I looked in the mirror and saw how red my eyes were. My eyelids looked swollen and my cheeks were pale. I felt a buzzing in my head, like my brain was about to shut off. I forced myself to stay upright. When I left the bathroom, I saw a silhouette in the hallway. It was close, maybe 3 or 4 steps away. Its outline stood out against the dark. My breath caught in my chest. I froze in place. My lips parted, but no sound came out. I took a slow step forward. The shape dissolved. I didn't see where it went. It just vanished. I noticed my hands were clenched so tight that my knuckles were sore. My heart hammered against my ribs. I muttered to myself, "You're just tired. It's not real." But my voice sounded shaky. The air in the apartment felt thick. I could smell my own sweat. That was when I started to question whether these shapes were hallucinations. They seemed too present, too consistent. They felt like they were watching me. The way they lingered at the edges of my vision made me feel violated, but I had no proof. Each time I tried to stare directly at one, it faded. I'd reach out, and my hand would grab nothing but empty air. After a few more sightings, my head felt like it was spinning. My chest felt tight. I kept blinking, trying to focus. My legs wobbled with every step. At dawn, I finally gave in. My body couldn't keep going. I was hunched over, leaning against the wall near my bedroom. My head was pounding and my hands were trembling so badly that I had to press them against my sides. My eyelids were slipping shut, and I couldn't control it anymore. I stumbled to the bed, dropped onto the mattress, and felt everything go dark. When I woke up many hours later, I still felt exhausted, but the silhouettes were gone. I checked every corner of my apartment. There was no sign of movement or shadows that looked out of place. I listened for clicks or scraping sounds, but I heard only the hum of the refrigerator. My entire body ached. My eyes felt swollen, and my throat was raw. I sat on the couch, staring at the empty corners of the room, replaying what had happened in my head. I wanted to believe it was just hallucinations from sleep deprivation, but I couldn't shake the memory of how real they seemed. I haven't done that experiment again. I still have insomnia, but I try to at least get a couple of hours of rest each night, just enough to avoid that level of exhaustion. I don't want to see those shadows again. I keep the lights on in the evening, and I avoid letting my mind wander too much in the dark. Sometimes I catch myself glancing at corners, worried that I might see a silhouette standing there, watching me. Whenever that fear creeps in, I tell myself it was just my tired brain playing tricks. But I still feel uneasy when I remember how it felt, how my heart pounded, and how the air seemed to thicken whenever I sensed one of those shapes. Even now, I'm not sure if it was all in my head, or if something else found a way inside when I was too exhausted to fight back. I still remember the moment I stepped inside that old mansion. My heart pounded from the start. I didn't go there to find ghosts or weird noises. I only wanted to record my voice in a big, empty space. I'm a musician, and I'm always looking for new places with unique acoustics. That mansion was over 100 years old, and I'd heard rumors that its halls had an incredible echo. I thought it would be perfect for some vocal experiments. I drove there in the late afternoon. The sky was a dull gray, and the wind felt chilly against my arms. I parked my car outside the rusted gates. The entire property looked abandoned. The gates squeaked when I pushed them open. The front yard was full of tall grass, weeds, and a few broken statues. I felt an odd tension in my stomach, but I tried to ignore it. I walked up to the front door, which looked weathered and warped from decades of rain and neglect. I stepped inside without much effort, since the lock was broken. The large entryway smelled like dust and something stale. My nose itched from the particles in the air. The floor was dark wood, full of scratches and random stains. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. I noticed a wide staircase in front of me. The walls were covered in old wallpaper that had peeled off in long strips. The windows above the main door were dirty and let in a faint light. It made everything look gray and lifeless. I took a deep breath and forced myself to relax. I set my backpack down and removed my portable recording device, a small microphone, and my phone. I also carried a portable speaker, but I decided to leave that in the bag for the time being. I wanted to explore the place first. My shoes squeaked against the wooden floor as I made my way through a doorway to the left. There was a large room that might have been a living room or parlor. Dust covered every piece of broken furniture. An old couch lay upside down, and there was a toppled bookshelf in one corner. I cleared my throat to test the acoustics. My voice echoed, but not much. I walked around, clapping my hands to see how the sound carried. I noticed that near the back of the room, the echo seemed more pronounced. I placed my recording device on a small table that stood on 3 legs, the fourth one broken off. It wobbled when I set my equipment down. Then I sang a few notes in a low tone, letting them carry through the empty space. I paused and listened back on my recorder. The effect sounded decent, but not as rich as I wanted. I decided to explore more of the mansion. I climbed the wide staircase in the main hall. Each step creaked under my weight. I moved slowly because I didn't want the wood to break. There was a musty odor on the second floor, stronger than downstairs. The windows up there were cracked, letting in thin drafts of cool air. The hallway stretched to the left and right. Both directions looked dark. I turned on the flashlight on my phone. The walls were lined with closed doors. Some of the doors were missing knobs. A few had large holes in them. I checked the first door on the right. The handle felt stiff. I pushed the door open with my shoulder. It led into a bedroom with a collapsed ceiling. Pieces of wood and plaster lay everywhere. I didn't even step inside. I backed away and tried the next door. This one was easier to open. It was a smaller room, empty, except for a single chair in the corner. The chair looked solid, but I didn't trust it. I coughed because there was a strong smell of mold. I walked inside and repeated the same process. I clapped and listened. The room had a short reverb, nothing too interesting. I left and kept moving. I felt a growing sense of unease. My shoulders were tense, and I kept looking behind me. The hallway was silent except for my footsteps. My breath sounded loud in my ears. Still, I tried to ignore the discomfort and pressed on. Eventually, I found a large room at the end of the hallway. It looked like a ballroom. There were tall windows on one side, all coated with grime. The floor was dusty, but still mostly intact. The ceiling had intricate patterns, though parts of the paint had peeled off. I stepped in and felt a slight chill on my neck. I set my bag near the doorway and removed my microphone stand. I placed it in the middle of the room. Then I tested my voice again. This time, the echo was strong and clear. My voice bounced back with a deep resonance. I spent maybe 15 minutes singing different notes and vocal lines. I adjusted the microphone a few times. The space had a hollow, yet warm sound. It was exactly the kind of texture I wanted for my tracks. At one point, I paused and asked out loud, "Is anyone here?" I didn't expect an answer. I just said it out of curiosity. The mansion was silent, except for a faint creak in the walls. I shrugged and went back to recording. After I finished, I packed up and decided it was time to leave. The sun was starting to set and the mansion felt colder. My back and neck were tight and my skin felt clammy. I wasn't actually frightened, but I wasn't comfortable either. It was an old place, and old places can feel heavy. I walked downstairs holding the railing. The wood felt rough. My footsteps sounded louder than before, and I noticed my heart rate had sped up. I reached the ground floor, grabbed my bag, and left through the front door. The air outside felt fresher, but I still had an odd feeling in my chest. I hurried back to my car, tossed my stuff in the trunk, and drove home. That night, I sat in my small home studio. I loaded the recordings onto my computer. I wore my headphones and scanned through the audio files. I was satisfied with most of them. The acoustics in that ballroom were perfect for what I wanted. Then I got to the file where I had asked, "Is anyone here?" I heard my voice echo and then a long silence. I cranked up the volume to check for any subtle room tone. That's when I heard it. A deep, raspy whisper said, "I'm behind you." It was faint, but clear enough to make me freeze. My scalp tingled and a chill ran down my spine. I ripped off my headphones and stared at the screen. My stomach clenched. I could still hear that voice in my head, repeating the words. It was in the recording, and there was no mistaking it. I played it again, this time through my speakers just to be sure. The whisper repeated the same phrase, "I'm behind you." I felt sweat on my forehead. My hands shook. I checked the waveform on my screen. It showed a small spike right after my question. I zoomed in on that section, but it didn't look like any typical audio anomaly. It looked like real speech. I remembered that I hadn't heard anything like that when I was in the mansion. It didn't sound like an echo or a trick of reverb. It sounded like someone answered me. My throat felt tight. My heart pounded so hard that my chest hurt. I tried to stay logical. Maybe it was interference or some weird feedback. But I knew it sounded too human. I kept thinking about the voice. It was low, almost guttural. It didn't sound like anything I had ever recorded before. I started breathing faster. My hands were clammy on the sides of my chair. I felt cornered in my own studio, which was ridiculous, but that was how my body reacted. I hit pause and leaned back in my chair. My eyes darted around my room, checking every dark corner. My studio is small. Just a desk, a computer, some soundproof foam on the walls, and a closed window. I didn't see anything strange, but my brain kept telling me that someone could be standing behind me, just out of sight. I forced myself to stand up and turn on the overhead light. I checked the closet. I opened the door to the hallway. I didn't find anything unusual. I sat down again and replayed the audio. My heart was still racing, but I wanted to be sure. The whisper didn't change. "I'm behind you." It sounded the same every time. I thought about going back to the mansion with better equipment and maybe bringing a friend along, but the idea made my stomach churn. I realized I had no desire to return. The place had given me what I wanted, unique acoustic recordings. That was enough. I stayed up late thinking about the incident. My head buzzed. I couldn't get the voice out of my mind. I tried to watch some random videos online to distract myself, but every few minutes my focus drifted back to that whispered phrase. I didn't feel safe, even though I was in my own home. The next day, I decided to tell a couple of friends about it. They seemed skeptical. One friend said I was probably imagining it or I had picked up radio interference. I didn't argue. I just let them think what they wanted. Deep down, I believed what I heard was real. It was a response to my question. It also felt personal, like something or someone had been there with me. I kept replaying the moment in my head. I saw myself in that ballroom, singing and talking, completely alone. Yet something else had been present. That thought made my legs feel weak. I tried to work on editing the audio, but I felt uneasy every time I approached that track. Hearing the voice again made my stomach tighten. I started skipping that particular file. I couldn't bring myself to delete it, but I didn't want to hear it anymore. I didn't even rename it. It stayed labeled as a random sequence of numbers. Over the next week, I had trouble sleeping. Whenever I closed my eyes, I pictured that empty mansion, I imagined myself standing there, hearing something breathing behind me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, certain that I heard a whisper. I'd check my room over and over, but I never found anything. My chest would feel heavy, and my mouth would go dry. I decided I would never step back into that mansion. I didn't care if it had the best acoustics in the world. I felt it was dangerous, or at least disturbing enough to avoid. My gear was safe at home, and that was all I needed. The idea of walking through those dark hallways again made my skin crawl. I couldn't imagine standing in that ballroom and hearing anything like that while I was physically there. I haven't deleted the recordings, but I don't listen to them anymore. They're stored on a backup drive. I sometimes wonder if I should just wipe them out. But part of me wants to keep them as proof of what happened. I haven't shared them publicly. I don't think anyone would believe me unless they heard it with their own ears. Even then, I'm sure people would call it a prank or a fake. That's fine. I know what I heard. I've picked up other projects since then, recording in safer, more ordinary locations. I've recorded in empty warehouses, underground parking garages, and even old churches. I haven't experienced anything strange in those places. I still enjoy finding unique acoustic spots, but I'm more cautious now. I always bring a friend or colleague if possible. I stick to well-documented buildings where I have permission to be. I don't wander alone into ancient, crumbling houses anymore. Sometimes late at night, I think about how my curiosity led me into that mansion. I remember feeling excited about the echoes and reverb. Then I remember that chilling whisper on the playback. I can still feel that jolt in my gut from the first time I heard it. My spine tingles when I recall the voice's tone. It felt so close, like it was right behind my head. I haven't gone back. I won't go back. That's the end of it for me. If there's something in that old mansion, it can stay there. I don't want to meet it in person. I got what I needed from that place. That's enough. If anyone ever asks about it, I just say it's not worth the trouble. If they push me for details, I'll say I didn't like the feel of the house. I don't mention the whisper. It's too personal and I don't want the attention. I still get goosebumps when I think about that phrase. It's like my mind replays it at random times, especially when I'm alone at night. I guess that's what happens when you find something you shouldn't. That voice answered me, and that was enough to make me stay away. I'm not a ghost hunter. I'm just a musician who wanted some cool recordings. I never asked for more than that. That's my story. I went into an old mansion to capture the natural reverb. I asked a dumb question. Is anyone here? I didn't hear anything back in real time, but later I played the audio and heard a voice whisper, "I'm behind you." I felt terror all over my body. I never returned to that place. I don't plan to, ever. That's all there is to say. I realized something was off the moment I stepped into that hallway. The air felt heavy and the light seemed weaker than usual. It was late, and I had stayed behind at the office to finish a project. I thought I was alone. I wanted peace and quiet to get ahead on my tasks. Instead, I ended up in the middle of an unsettling situation that still makes me uneasy when I think about it. My name is Carlos. I'm in my 30s. I work as a data analyst in a corporate building downtown. Last week, I had a deadline that I couldn't afford to miss. The final presentation was close, and I didn't want to disappoint my boss or my team. I decided to stay after hours. My supervisor and co-workers left around 7:00 p.m. They told me not to push myself too hard. I waved them off and said I'd be fine. I had snacks in my desk drawer, and I knew the coffee machine would keep me awake. My plan was to finish everything before sunrise, then catch a short nap in the break room. I worked through the evening with the door to my office closed. Occasionally, I'd hear the cleaning staff passing by in the hallway, rolling carts and talking in low voices. They finished around 10:00 p.m. I heard them gather their things and leave. After that, the entire floor fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. I had my desk lamp on and I typed up spreadsheets and emails. The security guard usually patrols the area around midnight, but he didn't stop by. I assumed he just glanced into the main hallway and saw my lights on. I didn't think much of it. Around 1 a.m., I felt stiff. My shoulders ached from sitting too long. My coffee had gone cold. I got up, stretched, and opened the door to head to the break room. That was when I first noticed the corridor looked different. The overhead lights created a faint flicker that I hadn't noticed before. The hallway felt longer than usual. I frowned and stood in the doorway, trying to figure out if I was just tired. I took a few steps forward, and I felt a cool draft around my ankles. There was a thin layer of mist on the floor. It wasn't a heavy fog, but it moved slowly across the tiles. My shoes caused small swirls in it. I stopped and listened. The air conditioner usually makes a low humming sound, but this was different. I heard a distant whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. I thought it might be the ventilation system acting up, but the sound felt too close. It seemed to come from different spots along the wall. It faded in and out. I glanced behind me. My office door was open, and the lamp was on. The corridor in that direction looked the same, except I could still see a slight haze near the floor. My first thought was that maybe there was a problem with the building's climate control. I decided to check the break room and see if the problem was happening there too. As I walked, the corridor didn't match my expectations. I knew the break room should have been about 50 feet down on the right. Instead, I saw more office doors, all dark inside, and they seemed to stretch out much farther. It looked like a never-ending row of identical doors with the same small nameplates and the same tinted windows. The lights overhead made a low buzzing sound. My chest felt tight and I found it hard to breathe calmly. The corridor felt too large, like it had expanded. I kept walking, but I didn't see the break room door. I stopped again and turned around. My office was gone from sight. I thought maybe I had missed it, so I took a few steps back. The corridor behind me seemed to extend just as far. I felt uneasy. My forehead started to sweat, and my hands felt clammy. I tried to control my breathing. I considered the possibility that I was just exhausted, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I walked back the way I came for about a minute. The hallway stayed the same. The white walls, the grayish floor tiles, the hum of the overhead lights, the faint mist. It didn't change. I decided to go back in the direction of the break room one more time. Right then, I felt a cold breeze push against my back. It wasn't strong, but it nudged me to turn around. I thought I heard a low rumble, like distant thunder coming from far ahead. I remember feeling my stomach tense and my neck muscles tighten. I didn't like the idea of walking deeper into that hallway, but I felt cornered. Every time I tried to move toward my office, I felt this slow, steady current of air pushing me forward. It wasn't violent, but it was persistent. I walked carefully, keeping my eyes on the ground. The mist was still there, sliding across the tiles. As I stepped, I heard soft whispers again. They seemed to come from behind the closed doors. Sometimes they sounded like my name. Other times I couldn't tell what they were saying, just a low, drawn-out murmur. It made my scalp itch. I tried the first door I saw, but the handle wouldn't budge. I tried the next door, and it was the same. It felt like each door was locked from the inside. After several minutes, I noticed an open door on my left. The sign beside it was blank. I leaned in and saw a small storage closet with a single flickering light bulb in the ceiling. There were shelves along the walls with old file boxes. The air smelled musty. My heart pounded, but I stepped inside anyway, hoping there might be a phone or something else I could use. I saw a desk chair pushed into a corner. The seat was ripped and the backrest was dusty. I heard the whispers coming from behind me in the hallway, but when I turned, I saw nothing. I tried to compose myself. I told myself I should check my phone. Maybe I'd get a signal and I could call someone. I pulled out my phone and glanced at the screen. The battery was around 30%. I saw no signal bars at all. That never happens in this building. But there I was with zero reception. My chest felt heavier. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I closed my eyes for a second and rubbed them, but the phone still showed no service. I pocketed it, frustrated. I decided to return to the corridor. The open door behind me swung shut by itself, making a dull thud. I felt a jolt in my chest. My limbs felt weak. I grabbed the handle and tried to open it again, but it was stuck. I yanked it a few times. The door didn't move. The corridor was quiet except for the buzzing of the lights. The floor still had that shifting mist. My breath sounded loud in my ears. I started walking forward again because going back felt pointless. I lost track of time. The corridor stayed the same length no matter how far I walked. Sometimes I'd see other open doors in the distance, but when I reached them, they were locked. At one point I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, I didn't see anyone. That happened several times. I'd hear slow, deliberate steps and then nothing. My heart raced and my back felt exposed. I started walking faster, hoping I'd hit a corner or a stairwell. After what felt like an hour, I finally saw a different door at the end of the hallway. It was metal with a big red sign that said exit. I felt a flicker of relief because it looked like a proper exit door. The push bar was visible. I hurried to it, ignoring the dull ache in my legs. When I reached it, I pressed down on the bar, expecting to step into the stairwell. The door opened a crack, and a freezing gust of air blew into my face. It felt sharp on my skin. The hinges made a squeak, and I saw darkness on the other side. I tried to step through, but the cold hit me so hard that my eyes teared up. My teeth started chattering. I held the door open with my shoulder and reached my hand into the darkness. I couldn't feel a wall or a floor. It was just emptiness with a howling wind. I pulled my hand back and stared into the pitch-black space, unsure what I was supposed to do. I let the door close and stood there, shivering. The metal surface felt cool against my hand. I felt those whispers again, brushing against my ears, telling me to keep going. My heart pounded. My arms felt tense. I didn't want to step into that void. I turned around to see if the corridor behind me had changed. It looked the same. Endless doors, flickering lights, silent haze on the floor. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe this was some sort of weird dream. Maybe I'd passed out at my desk. I pinched my arm until it hurt. I felt wide awake. I pressed my palm against the wall, feeling the slight texture of the paint. It was real. My eyes stung from exhaustion. My throat was dry. I wondered if I could just wait it out until morning, but I had no sense of time. My watch just showed the same hour. The minute hand barely moved each time I checked. My phone screen looked the same. No signal. The battery was draining, but the time displayed made no sense. It jumped back and forth between 1:02 a.m. and 1:09 a.m. I started to feel short of breath again. I took a few steps back from the exit door. I saw another door on the left side of the corridor, slightly ajar. I moved toward it. This door looked like an old office entrance with a scratched doorknob. The plate had no name. I nudged it open with my foot. The hinges squeaked. Inside, I saw desks and chairs in disarray. There were papers scattered on the floor. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, revealing dusty monitors and abandoned office supplies. It reminded me of a place that had been deserted quickly. The air smelled stale, like old carpet that hadn't been cleaned in a long time. I stepped inside, scanning the room for anything useful. I saw a phone on one of the desks. I rushed over and picked it up, but there was no dial tone. I tested the receiver, pressing the buttons, but it stayed silent. I opened a few desk drawers, searching for a flashlight or a set of keys. I found paper clips, sticky notes, and business cards for people I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I fumbled through the contents. I felt a chill in the air, and my breath felt shallow. My ears were alert to every small sound. Suddenly, I heard a voice behind me. It sounded like a gasp or a sharp intake of breath. I spun around. There was no one there. My pulse hammered in my neck. My palms were damp. I gripped the edge of the desk and tried to steady myself. I thought about yelling for help, but I had a sense that might draw something toward me. I swallowed hard and pressed my lips together. Then there was a thump on the other side of the office. It came from a small door that probably led to a storage closet. The door rattled for a moment, then went still. I took a slow step in that direction, but I paused when I saw the doorknob move slightly. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what to expect. My instincts told me to get out of that room. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the doorknob. It turned halfway, then stopped. I heard more whispering in the hall, like it was calling me back. The air in the office felt suffocating. I walked backward until I reached the open door that led back to the corridor. The corridor lights felt brighter for a second, and I saw the mist swirl around the threshold. I glanced over my shoulder and I realized the corridor looked different again. This time it seemed shorter. I could see my office door in the distance. The light from my desk lamp peeked out. My heart lifted a little. I turned fully around and started jogging toward my office. The push from behind was gone and I felt in control of my movement again. As I approached my office, I reached out to touch the walls to keep my balance. My body was shaking and my teeth chattered lightly, not from cold but from stress. The hall was quiet except for my footsteps. The mist had thinned, but it was still drifting across the floor. I forced my legs to keep moving, step by step, until I was right in front of my office door. It was open just as I'd left it. My computer screen was on, showing the spreadsheet I had been working on. The desk lamp was the only light inside. I stepped in and closed the door behind me. My first thought was to lock it. I turned the deadbolt, then leaned against the door, breathing hard. The room felt warm in comparison to the corridor. My pulse slowly calmed, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. I hurried to my phone charger, plugged my phone in, and checked the time on my computer. It showed 4:15 a.m. That seemed more or less right. The phone still had no signal, but at least it was charging. I spent the next hour sitting at my desk, staring at the door. I didn't hear any more whispers. The corridor outside looked normal through the small glass panel on my door. The mist was gone. I saw the overhead lights shining like they always did. I was too scared to go back out, so I just waited. Around 5 a.m., the sky started to lighten outside my window. I decided to gather my things and head to the elevator. My legs felt weak, but I managed to walk out of the office. The corridor was its usual length. The break room was where it should have been. I walked past it and continued to the elevator, hitting the button until the doors opened. The ride down to the lobby was uneventful. The front doors opened easily, and I stepped outside into the early morning air. I haven't told my coworkers about that night. I still don't know if I imagined it or if something in that building changes after midnight. But I know what I saw. I remember the feel of that cold wind pushing me forward, and I remember the endless corridor with locked doors and flickering lights. Even now, I get nervous if I stay past sunset. I avoid that floor whenever I can. I finish my work early. I leave before the cleaning staff finishes. I don't want to be alone there when everyone goes home. It still feels dangerous, and I can't shake the memory of that open exit door with nothing but freezing darkness on the other side. I'm just glad I got out. I don't plan on staying overnight in that office again. If anyone else asks me about working late, I tell them I have plans. I'm not risking another long night with a hallway that isn't what it seems. I came here because I wanted peace and quiet. I wanted to escape the noise of the city and breathe real air. I never expected to see shadows moving on their own. That first moment, when I noticed them dancing in the firelight, made my chest tighten. My hands actually shook as I tried to figure out what was happening. I had been to many campsites before, but this was different. This was supposed to be a remote nature reserve, a place few people ever visited. I thought that meant I would be alone with my thoughts. I was wrong. I arrived earlier in the day, around mid-morning. The drive took about 4 hours from my apartment in the city. Most of that time, I had the windows down, letting the wind hit my face. I remember seeing fewer and fewer cars as I got closer to the reserve. At one point, I went almost an hour without passing another vehicle on the road. That made me feel excited. I had a sense of freedom that I only get when I know I'm far from the usual crowds. I parked my car on a small gravel lot near the entrance. There was a wooden sign that looked faded and old. It had the name of the reserve, but no other information. I grabbed my backpack and a duffel bag with my camping gear. I also had a cooler with some food, mostly sandwiches and a few protein bars. The air smelled fresh, without any strong odors or hints of pollution. I took a deep breath, feeling my lungs expand in a way that never happens in the city. It felt good. My shoulders relaxed. I was confident this trip would do me a lot of good. I walked along a narrow trail that cut through thick trees. They were tall, with rough bark. I could see patches of sunlight streaking down through the leaves. The ground was soft and damp. I spotted a few small animals, maybe squirrels or chipmunks, darting between fallen branches. Every so often I heard birds calling out from the treetops. There was a sense of calm all around me. I chose a spot to set up camp near a small clearing. It wasn't an official campsite. There was no sign or fire pit, but the ground was level, and the trees formed a wide circle around it. I liked the privacy. I could see some older footprints, so maybe a few other campers had used this area in the past. I dropped my bag and started unpacking. I had a simple one-person tent, so it didn't take me long to put it up. I hammered the stakes down, double-checked the straps, and unrolled my sleeping bag inside. Then I gathered some rocks to form a circle for a safe fire. That was my plan for nightfall. I always liked the glow of a real fire when camping. After I finished setting up, I took a small walk around the area. I made sure I knew where a nearby stream was so I could collect water. I carried a small filtration pump in my pack. I also wanted to see if there was any sign of other people around. I found nothing that indicated fresh footprints or recent activity. The forest floor showed only animal tracks, mostly deer or raccoon prints. The place felt empty and quiet. The day passed quickly. I did some light exploring, walking through the trees and checking out small paths that forked off from the main trail. I noticed thick patches of moss on some of the rocks. Everything was damp in that shadowy undergrowth. The air had a light chill, but it wasn't uncomfortable. By the time the sun started to go down, I felt pretty tired. I returned to my campsite and got ready to build a fire. I had collected enough kindling, so I set it up inside the ring of rocks and lit it with a lighter. The flames started small, but soon they were big enough to keep me warm. I sat on a small folding chair near my tent. I heated up some instant noodles in a small metal pot over the fire. I noticed the light fading quickly. The sky took on a gray tone that covered the tree line. My only light source was the fire. The flames made the surrounding area flicker with a warm glow, but everything beyond the ring of light was pitch black. I heard crickets chirping. Occasionally, a breeze would pass through the treetops, making the branches creak. I felt comfortable but also slightly uneasy. There's always that moment when it gets so dark that you can't see anything except what's lit up by your lantern or your fire. That's when my nerves prickled a bit. While stirring my noodles, I looked at the trees around me. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. I just saw dark outlines. But then, on one of the trunks, I saw a shadow. It looked odd because it wasn't shaped like a branch or the trunk itself. It had a smoother outline, like a silhouette of a person with hands clasped in front. My stomach tensed up. I blinked a couple times, trying to see if maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the shape remained. The fire crackled, and the shadow seemed to move slightly. I stood up, holding my pot by the handle. I walked a few steps closer. I figured there had to be some explanation. Maybe a branch or root structure was casting a weird form. But the shape shifted, bending at the waist as though it was bowing. My pulse jumped, and I gripped the handle of my pot tighter. I took another step, but the shadow faded when I got too close to the trunk. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw another shape on a different tree. I turned and saw something that looked like a silhouette of a person kneeling with arms raised. My chest felt tight again. I retreated to the fire, thinking maybe the dancing flames were creating illusions. My hands were sweating. I put down my pot and wiped my palms on my jeans. I looked around me in a slow circle. There were more shadows. On 3 or 4 different trees, I saw human-like outlines. They had different postures. One had its arms extended, another looked like it was pressing its hands together, and another appeared to be crouching. They all seemed to be in some sort of prayer pose. I felt a cold shock run through my back. It was like a sudden wave of goosebumps. I told myself to calm down. I checked my fire. The flames had faded, but the shadow remained. I sat on a small folding chair near my tent. I The flames were strong, but they were flickering from side to side because of the light breeze. Every time the flames changed direction, the shadows moved. I realized they weren't stationary. They shifted and swayed as though controlled by something else. The weird part was that they didn't seem to match any objects behind me. I looked for branches or tall grass that could create such shapes. Nothing lined up. It was like these outlines had no real source. I forced myself to sit down and eat. My stomach churned with nerves, but I hadn't eaten much all day. The noodles tasted bland. My mind was too focused on the shapes. Every time I glanced at the tree line, I saw them in different positions. They always stayed away from the direct light, lingering in the darker areas. Whenever I tried to ignore them, I felt this uncomfortable prickle at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I started to hear rustling sounds behind the trees. It could have been animals, maybe raccoons or small critters moving around, searching for food. But it all blended together with the eerie images I was seeing. I couldn't relax. My heart kept thumping, and my breathing felt shallow. At one point, I stood up and walked around the fire to see if changing my angle would affect the shadows. They seemed to follow the same pattern, always staying just out of reach of direct light. I grabbed my flashlight from my bag. It was a strong one, the kind with a high lumen output. I aimed it at one of the silhouettes. It vanished immediately when the beam touched it. Then, when I moved the flashlight away, it reappeared. It took on the shape of a person with folded arms. That made my scalp feel tight, like all the hairs on the back of my head were standing on end. I told myself, this is just some trick of light. I spoke aloud, because I needed to hear my own voice. It sounded shaky. I tried to stay logical. I looked at the branches overhead, the angle of the moon, and the flickering fire, but none of it seemed to match what I was seeing. I decided to stoke the fire, thinking maybe a stronger flame would get rid of these weird illusions. I gathered more wood from around the clearing, keeping my flashlight on to avoid stepping on anything. While gathering wood, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I saw shadows glide along the tree trunks. They didn't move like normal shadows. They swayed in unnatural patterns, like they were bowing or swaying in unison. When I returned, I stacked the fire with more wood until it grew much larger. Sparks shot into the air. I had to step back from the heat. Now the campsite was well lit, but the extra light didn't help much. The shadows grew more defined. Some of them formed what looked like a row of figures, all standing with their hands together. I felt sweat drip down my forehead, more from fear than from the heat. I thought about packing up my gear and leaving right away, but I wasn't sure if driving out of there in the dark was the best idea, especially since the road was narrow and unlit. My chest tightened with the thought of trying to navigate that forest road at night. So I tried to hold out. I told myself I could stay until morning, then leave as soon as the sun came up. I sat by the fire, arms wrapped around my knees, scanning the tree line. Every so often I would see a cluster of these silhouettes shift positions. One moment they looked like they were kneeling. Next moment they were standing with heads bent to the side. I didn't hear any voices, but I felt a pressure in my ears, like the forest was holding its breath. My body's reactions got worse as the night went on. My palms were damp, my legs felt weak, and my heart pounded so hard that I could feel my pulse in my ears. I tried to distract myself by cleaning up my cooking gear. I slowly scrubbed the pot with a piece of cloth, focusing on each movement, but my eyes kept darting up to track the shadows. Around midnight, the wind changed direction. I heard a low whistle through the treetops. The fire crackled louder, and embers scattered. The shadows circled around me, always on the edges. It looked like they were getting closer, forming a half ring around the campsite. I could swear I saw outlines of people in hooded shapes, but I knew that was just my brain trying to process those dancing silhouettes. Suddenly, I felt a strong urge to stand up. My legs were shaking, but I managed to get to my feet. I held my flashlight like a weapon and turned in a slow circle. I shouted, "Is anyone out there?" My voice broke on the last word. No answer. I heard only the rustling of leaves and a faint hiss from the fire. My pulse raced. I tried to breathe slowly, counting each inhale and exhale. My skin felt clammy under my jacket. I stayed standing for a long time, pointing the flashlight at the trees. The beams cut through the darkness but revealed nothing solid. The shadows vanished under the direct light. Yet when I swung the beam away, they crept back. My mind started racing. I thought about all the stories people tell about haunted forests or strange rituals. I had always rolled my eyes at those tales, but now I was living something that made no sense to me. Eventually, I moved closer to the tent and zipped it open. I wanted some kind of barrier around me, even if it was just a thin sheet of nylon. I crawled inside and sat on top of my sleeping bag. I left the fire burning outside so the tent interior glowed with an orange hue. I could see the silhouettes through the tent walls flickering and shifting. I tried to block it out, but every time a strong gust of wind hit, the shadows stretched across the material of the tent, showing those eerie shapes again. My heart wouldn't slow down. I checked the time on my phone, a little past 2 a.m. That realization made me feel worse. The night felt endless. I tried to focus on the sound of the crackling fire, telling myself it would keep animals away, telling myself I was still safe. The flickering silhouettes kept dancing. I almost unzipped the tent again to add more wood to the fire, but I was too nervous to face the full force of those shadows outside. My mouth felt dry and I couldn't stop swallowing. My hands trembled when I rubbed them together. I stayed like that, half sitting, half lying, for what felt like hours. My body was tense and my eyes were wide open. I kept waiting for something else to happen, like a voice or a figure stepping forward. But nothing came. It was just those moving shapes on the trees. Sometimes they shifted faster, almost like they were rocking back and forth. Other times they barely moved, standing in a row. A little before dawn, I noticed a slight change in the sky. It was no longer completely black. I unzipped the tent and looked out. The fire had burned down to embers. I could see a faint gray light through the trees. The shadows were still there, but they were softer. They blended with the natural shapes of the forest. My shoulders dropped a bit. I realized I had survived the night, even though my nerves were shot. My eyes stung from lack of sleep. I crawled out of the tent and immediately started putting things away. I kicked dirt over the embers to extinguish them. I didn't bother waiting to eat a proper breakfast. I stuffed my sleeping bag into its sack and dismantled the tent as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, and my stomach felt like it was twisted in knots. All I wanted was to get out of there. The forest felt too still. I glanced at the trees one last time. No more dancing silhouettes. The sunlight was weak, but it was enough to make them disappear. Once I was packed, I hiked back toward my car. I didn't see or hear anyone else the entire time. The forest trail seemed normal again. I reached the gravel lot, unlocked my car, and loaded my gear. My heart was still racing, but I felt a rush of relief as soon as I turned on the engine. I drove off, leaving that reserve behind me. My mind replayed the images of those shadows. I didn't want to think about them, but I couldn't help it. On the drive home, I kept looking into my rearview mirror. Part of me expected to see something moving in the back seat, even though I knew that was impossible. Every time I stopped at a red light, my legs bounced restlessly, and my hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I couldn't get rid of the memory of those outlines and how they bowed and swayed in the darkness. I made it back to my apartment by midday. I shut the door, dropped my bags, and sank into my couch. My chest felt heavy. My mind was rattled. I had never felt so unsettled from a camping trip before. I stared at the walls of my living room for a long time, just trying to feel normal again. Since that night, I haven't been able to explain what happened. I keep telling myself it must have been a trick of the firelight combined with the movement of branches in the wind. But deep down, I don't fully believe that. I felt something in those woods. I felt watched. I saw those silhouettes shift in ways that didn't match any normal shadows. I don't know why they looked like people praying or performing a ritual, but that's exactly what I saw. I haven't gone camping since. I keep thinking about going back to see if it would happen again, but every time I think about it, my stomach clenches and I feel cold sweat on my forehead. Maybe one day I'll have the nerve to return. but I doubt I'll ever do it alone. Those shadows in that forest still haunt me. I can't shake the feeling that if I were to go back, I might see them again, and this time they would come closer. I still feel a tightness in my chest when I think about what happened that day. It started out pretty ordinary. I drove out to this old rural property because the owner said water kept dripping into the attic whenever it rained. He wanted me to check the roof. I do small contracting work and odd jobs, so I agreed to take a look. I didn't expect anything strange. I just planned to climb up, find the source of the leak, and figure out how to fix it. But the moment I got a look at the roof, everything changed. The house stood at the end of a long dirt road. There were patches of tall grass on both sides, and I noticed a line of fence posts that hadn't been maintained in years. The place looked deserted, but the owner told me his family used to live there until a few months ago. They had moved out because they suspected the foundation was getting weak. As soon as I parked my truck and stepped out, I caught a smell of damp wood. The front porch was sagging. Several windows were boarded up. The wind made a low whistle through a broken shutter on the side. I felt uneasy, but I brushed it off. I told myself I was there to check a roof and nothing else. I walked around the side of the house to find a good entry point. The owner had warned me the inside was cluttered with old furniture and tools, so I might have trouble getting to the attic from indoors. He suggested using the skylight on the second floor. I grabbed my flashlight, a small tool bag, and started looking for a safe way up. There was a wide set of rickety stairs leading to the second floor. When I stepped inside the house, the smell of mold and dust got stronger. My boots echoed on the warped floorboards. I paused every few steps to make sure they wouldn't give out. The hallway was dim. I only saw streaks of sunlight poking through cracks in the walls and the edges of boarded windows. I found the door to what looked like an old storage room. There were shelves knocked over, and I saw piles of magazines, empty jars, and some rusted metal parts on the floor. I was glad I had my flashlight because there were no working lights in that place. After some searching, I spotted a hatch in the ceiling that seemed to lead to the attic, but the shape of it looked too small to climb through. The owner's instructions mentioned a skylight in the upstairs hallway that opened onto the roof, so I decided to find that instead. The second floor corridor was in bad shape. The wallpaper was peeling. A few of the doors were missing. There was a flicker of daylight at the far end, and I realized that must be the skylight. When I reached it, I saw a small wooden ladder leaning against the wall. It looked old, but still sturdy enough. I leaned my weight on the bottom step, and it didn't break, so I climbed. My heart was pounding harder than usual. I tried to tell myself it was just the stress of being in an old, musty house that might collapse if I wasn't careful. But a small voice in my head said I felt uneasy for another reason. Something about the silence in that place unsettled me. I reached the top of the ladder and popped my head through the skylight. Outside, I could see most of the roof. It was covered in dry leaves, some branches, and a few cracked tiles near the chimney. The sky was gray, but it wasn't raining. A breeze blew across the top of the house. I lifted myself up until my shoulders were level with the roof, trying to get a better look at the chimney area. My plan was to walk over there and check if any tiles were loose or if mortar had crumbled around the chimney base. That's when I saw the figure. At first, it was just a shape. It looked like someone crouching near the chimney. The person's body was mostly hidden behind it, but I could see a head and shoulders. I stopped moving and held my breath. I remember thinking, why is someone up here? I expected maybe a squatter or another contractor, but the way the figure stayed still made my stomach clench. I tried to focus my eyes, but I couldn't make out any facial details except these pale, almost colorless eyes staring right at me. They were fixed on my face. I felt my pulse slam against my ears. It wasn't just that someone was there, it was how motionless they were, how those eyes didn't blink. For a moment, I just froze. I had one knee on the ladder and my hands on the edge of the skylight. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. My mind raced. I thought maybe I should call out, ask who it was. but something about that stare made my throat feel tight. My palms were sweating and I could feel the ladder wobble. I tried to convince myself this was just a person who maybe lived in the area or had been trespassing. But deep down, I felt something else, like I was looking at something that didn't belong there. I blinked, and in that split second, the figure was gone. It didn't run. It didn't jump. I heard no footsteps on the roof. One moment I was staring at those pale eyes. The next, there was empty space by the chimney. I looked around, glanced at the sides, the edges, anywhere a person could have jumped or climbed down, but I saw and heard nothing. The breeze picked up and blew a few leaves across the roof. I started to shake. My arms felt weak. My first real thought was that I needed to get out of there. I climbed back down the ladder so fast I almost slipped. My knee banged against one of the rungs and I bit my tongue, trying not to shout from the pain. Once my feet hit the floor, I yanked the ladder away from the skylight, half expecting someone to come crashing down after me. But there was only silence. My chest felt tight. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven. My mouth was dry. I grabbed my flashlight from my belt and shone it around, half expecting that figure to appear in the hallway. All I saw was chipped paint, cracked walls, and broken floorboards. I forced myself to calm down. I told myself I was imagining things. I hadn't slept well the night before. Maybe my eyes played a trick on me. But my heart wouldn't stop racing. My head felt light, like I was on the edge of passing out. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, leaning against the wall. The smell of dampness and old wood seemed stronger, almost suffocating. Then I heard a noise from somewhere above me. It sounded like a quick scrape, like something shifting on the roof. It might have been a branch or just the wind. But in that moment, every hair on my arm stood up. I couldn't handle staying there. I turned and hurried down the hallway. The boards creaked under my boots, and at one point my foot caught on a loose piece of carpet, and I nearly went sprawling. My flashlight rolled on the floor. I picked it up with shaking fingers and kept going. I needed to get out of that house. When I reached the top of the main staircase, I paused to look back. The corridor was still empty. The skylight let in a patch of gray light. No movement, no sign of that figure. Yet my brain kept replaying those pale eyes. I had never seen eyes like that before. They looked almost without color, almost like they belonged to a statue or something else, not a normal human being. My stomach churned. I forced myself to walk down the steps. Each step felt unsteady, like the wood might snap under me. I gripped the railing and focused on moving my feet carefully, not wanting to break my neck on the way out. My shoulders were tense. My jaw was clenched. I just kept thinking, keep going, keep going. I finally got to the ground floor. The front door was jammed, so I had come in through a side door. I made my way back through the dusty rooms, pushing past broken furniture and scattered junk. My flashlight flickered, and for a second, I worried the batteries were dying. I didn't want to be left in the dark in that house. I reached the side entrance, kicked aside some broken wood, and shoved the door open into the sunlight. My truck sat there on the patch of dirt. I felt a wave of relief. Outside, I could breathe again. The fresh air hit me, and I realized how tense my muscles were. I practically ran to my truck and threw my gear in the passenger seat. I slid behind the wheel and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking, so I took a few deep breaths. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. I started the engine and backed out, my tires crunching over the gravel. I glanced up at the roof one last time. The chimney was in the same place, obviously, and nothing else was visible. No movement, no figure. I told myself to stop looking and just leave. I drove down that dirt road faster than I should have. Dust kicked up in the rearview mirror. My heart was pounding in my throat. I tried to make sense of what I had seen. The person, or thing, or whatever it was, had been right there by the chimney. They were staring right at me with those pale eyes. Then they were gone without a trace. It wasn't normal. It wasn't rational. I slammed my fist on the steering wheel at one point, frustrated at how scared I was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to put as much distance between me and that house as possible. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled off to the side and stopped. I leaned forward, resting my head on the steering wheel, and tried to steady my breathing. My pulse was hammering, and my shirt was damp from sweat. Everything felt too quiet. Cars passed in the distance, but I was focused on my own breathing and the whirring of my truck's engine. I started to wonder if I should call the owner or maybe the police. Then I realized I didn't have anything concrete to tell them. I didn't see footprints. I didn't hear voices. I only saw a crouched figure with pale eyes that disappeared. Who would believe that? I sat there for a while, wrestling with what to do. Eventually, I decided to call the owner and let him know the roof probably needed major repairs and that I couldn't finish the inspection. I didn't go into detail about what happened. I told him I got spooked by something up there, maybe an animal or a trespasser, and that I couldn't stay on the property any longer. He sounded surprised and a little annoyed, but I didn't care. I wasn't going back on that roof. For the rest of the afternoon, I kept picturing that figure. I kept thinking about those eyes. It felt like they were burned into my mind. I tried to distract myself by running errands in town. I stopped for coffee, then got a sandwich, but my hands were still trembling when I picked up my cup. A part of me wanted to convince myself it was just a regular person wearing weird contact lenses or something. But I hadn't seen any details. No hair color, no clothes, no facial expression. Just pale eyes in a shadowy shape. The memory gave me chills. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that crouched figure. I'd feel the same cold dread in my stomach. My body would tense up and I'd jolt awake. I turned on my bedside lamp and tried to read something to calm down, but my mind kept returning to that roof. That moment I blinked, and the figure vanished. I felt restless. I got up and paced around my room, chewing on my lip. Sometimes I felt a burst of anger toward myself for getting so worked up. Other times, I felt a rush of fear that maybe I'd see that figure again. Over the next few days, I kept getting calls from the owner. He wanted to know more about what happened. I finally told him straight. I saw someone on the roof. They disappeared, and I got scared. That's all there was to it. I suggested he hire someone else to check the leak. He tried to ask if it might have been a thief or a drifter. I said maybe, but I wasn't sure. I knew what I saw, and it didn't make any sense. He didn't push me after that. I guess he realized I wasn't going back there no matter how much he offered. I still feel uneasy thinking about that old house. I can picture the boarded windows, the broken shutter, the dark hallway, and the way the skylight let out onto the roof. I keep asking myself if there was some trick of the light, or if my mind was playing games. But my gut tells me there was something up there, something real enough to stare me in the eyes and vanish without a sound. That kind of thing stays with you. It's been a while now, and I haven't told many people about it. Most folks would laugh or call me crazy, but I know what I felt. I know how my body reacted. That kind of fear doesn't come from nowhere. I haven't set foot on that property again, and I don't plan to. The memory alone is enough to give me chills. Sometimes, when I'm doing other jobs, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder if I hear a noise. My hands go clammy, and my pulse jumps. I remind myself I'm just being paranoid. Still, I'd rather be safe than sorry. Whatever I saw, I don't want to see it again. If anyone else wants to go check that roof, they can do it without me. I'm done with that place, and I'm fine with never finding out what or who I really saw there. I noticed the silence right away. The moment I stepped out of my truck, I couldn't hear any birds or wind. The air felt heavy against my skin. I looked around and saw a single dirt road leading deeper into the village. The sun was low, casting long shadows on the ground. The place looked lifeless. I had come here to check the status of the abandoned houses for an inventory report. A colleague had mentioned this village near the lake and told me I might find some old structures worth noting. He didn't tell me I'd feel like I'd walked into a place where time had stopped. I started down the road, keeping my eyes on the boarded-up windows. Every house seemed to have planks nailed across the frames. Some doors were cracked and a few roofs had caved in. My boots crunched on gravel as I made my way forward. I could smell damp wood and something stale, like old dust. A weak breeze came off the lake, rustling the few dead weeds near the fences. I kept expecting to see someone pop out or call to me, but the street stayed empty. I reached a row of small houses on my left. Their walls were faded. One still had a tattered curtain peeking through the boards. I paused and listened. I heard my own breathing. I heard my heartbeat thumping in my ears. Usually in a deserted area, I might hear animals skittering around. Here, it was just quiet. I felt a chill on my arms despite the warm temperature. The sun was dipping lower, which made the shadows spread across the ground in strange angles. I reached one of the biggest buildings in sight. It looked like some communal hall or storage facility. The front had tall double doors with chipped paint. Windows on either side were covered by thick boards. The place had a roof with broken shingles, and a small tower rose from the center. A battered bell hung there, swinging a little with the breeze. I thought about heading inside, but something caught my eye near the corner of the building. At first, I thought I saw two people standing still, facing the wall. They looked human-sized, but their skin was grayish. I couldn't make out any facial features. It was like they were blurred. It startled me, so I stopped for a moment to focus my eyes. Their heads seemed featureless. Their limbs were thin and their posture was odd, like they were leaning forward. My heart gave a heavy thump. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. My muscles tensed. I took a slow step in their direction. As soon as I moved, they turned as if they sensed me. They glided backward, disappearing behind a section of crumbling concrete that might have been part of a sidewall. They didn't run or walk in a normal way. They slipped away so smoothly, I almost doubted what I'd seen. My instinct kicked in. I wanted to see if there were actually people living here or if I was imagining shapes in the shadows. I hurried toward where they vanished. My boots echoed on the cracked pavement near the building. I came around the corner and found nothing but a small yard with overgrown grass, some broken barrels, and a rusty old wheelbarrow turned upside down. There were no footprints in the dirt except my own. The grass swayed a bit. I checked behind the wheelbarrow. I even looked behind some broken crates. Nobody was there. I felt a spike of adrenaline course through me. My heartbeat pounded in my chest. My breathing was shallow. I stood there, straining my ears for any sound of footsteps or movement. Still nothing. Just that same dead quiet. I remember wiping the sweat off my brow with the back of my hand. I didn't want to believe I'd just seen something impossible, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. I stared at the wall. The surface was gray, crumbling in places. No sign of anyone hiding. My stomach felt knotted, and I started to question whether I should keep looking around or get back in my truck and report an empty village. I decided to continue. I'd come this far, and my job was to note down the condition of the area. I walked around the building to see if there was an entrance that wasn't boarded up. I found a side door with peeling paint. I pulled on it, and it gave a little but was stuck. I rammed it with my shoulder and it creaked open, letting out a strong, musty smell that made me cough. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and shined it inside. The hallway was dark and smelled of rotted wood. The floor was warped from water damage, and each step squeaked under me. I saw boxes stacked against the walls. Some were collapsed, and a few had soggy paper spilling out. I went over to one of the boxes and picked up a piece of paper. It felt brittle. It had notes about storage inventories, dates, and a few scribbles I couldn't make sense of. I brushed off the dust and set it aside. In the faint light, I could see old metal shelves along one side of the hall. They were empty except for a few rusty cans. I pushed forward, flashlight beam jumping from wall to wall. The corridor opened into a larger room with a high ceiling. I spotted something that looked like a makeshift office. There was a desk covered in more papers and a broken chair on its side. A small window near the ceiling let in a bit of orange light from the setting sun. The room was still and silent. I could hear my own breathing echo. My neck and shoulders felt tight. I wondered if those gray figures might appear behind me. I forced myself to keep moving. I approached the desk, stepping carefully around fallen debris. Part of the ceiling had collapsed in a corner. I listened for any movement. My ears were on high alert. My pulse was still fast. No sounds. I set my flashlight on the desk and started flipping through the papers. Most were receipts, logs, and scribbled notes. They were dated decades ago. I found references to shipments, building materials, and some local events. There were also mention of house repairs around the village. Nothing explained why it was all abandoned or why I had seen two faceless figures outside. I heard a noise behind me. It sounded like a scrape or a soft shuffle. I spun around, flashlight in hand, shining it into the corners. My mouth went dry. I stared at the darkness, feeling my heart pound. I waited, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt, but I couldn't see anything. I stood like that for maybe a full minute, breathing in shallow gulps, ears straining. No follow-up sound, just that silent tension. I decided I had enough of the building. I picked up a couple of the papers to show someone back at the office. Maybe these would help piece together what had happened here. Before leaving, I did a quick scan of the shelves. I noticed a small iron box on the top shelf, but it was locked, and I didn't have time to pry it open. It was too high for me to reach without risking stepping on the warped bottom shelf. I left it there, grabbed my papers, and headed back down the hallway. As soon as I stepped onto the road again, I realized the sun was almost gone. The last light was fading on the horizon, and the sky had a dull color. The shape of the houses looked more menacing in the twilight. I glanced around and saw no sign of movement. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I decided to check a few more houses before leaving, just to confirm if everything was truly abandoned. I went to the nearest house. It had a short fence around a small yard. The gate squeaked when I pushed it. The door was shut but missing its doorknob. I nudged it and it swung open easily. Inside, the living room was empty. The walls had water stains and some paint had peeled off in strips. I smelled old plaster and mold. I noticed a pile of rags near the corner, maybe a makeshift bed. Someone might have squatted here at some point, but it seemed abandoned now. I wandered into the kitchen area. The counters were covered in dust. There was an empty cabinet with missing doors. The sink had a rusted faucet. I walked across the creaking floor to a back room. It was too dark to see much, so I shined my flashlight. The windows were boarded from the outside. I felt a draft of cold air coming from a small crack in the boards. My heart rate started to calm a bit, because everything just seemed old and deserted. I wondered if those figures had been some trick of the light or if they were actual people. Still, my gut told me something wasn't right. I decided I'd gather whatever details I could, then leave. I moved outside again and tried another house across the street. The front door was locked. I circled around and found a side window that had a loose board. I pried it open enough to peek in. It was pitch black inside, so I shone the flashlight. The beam revealed a small room with scattered furniture, a couch missing its cushions, a broken table, and a chair on its side. There was an open door leading to another room, but I couldn't see inside without climbing in. I didn't feel comfortable crawling into a place where I might get trapped or cornered, so I decided to skip that one. As I stepped away from the window, I thought I heard a whisper or a faint voice coming from somewhere down the street. It was so soft I wasn't sure if it was the wind. My body tensed again. I strained my ears, but it was gone. I checked my phone for signal, but I had no service. The battery icon was still okay, but that didn't help if I couldn't connect. I looked at the darkening sky and knew I didn't have much daylight left. I sighed and decided to head back toward my truck. On the walk back, I glanced over my shoulder every few steps. My palms felt clammy. My breathing came in quick bursts. Every boarded window seemed like it was watching me. Every empty yard looked like it could hide something. I sped up, wanting to reach the truck before total darkness. My pulse hammered in my head. I thought about those two gray figures. Why did they have no faces? Were they even people? Or was there some weird reflection of light? I tried to force that thought out, telling myself I was just spooked by an empty town and the dim lighting. When I got to my truck, I fumbled for my keys. I threw my notes on the passenger seat and took one last look at the road behind me. I don't know what I expected. Maybe I thought I would see them again, standing in the middle of the street staring at me. But the street was empty. I climbed in and started the engine. The sound of it felt comforting. My headlights lit up the houses as I turned the truck around. For a split second, I thought I saw a gray figure in the beam of my right headlight, but it could have been a shadow from a fence post. I didn't stop to check. I drove away, my hands tight on the wheel. The narrow road was bumpy, and the truck rattled as it moved over the uneven ground. The sky was growing darker with every minute. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something trailing behind me. My mouth was dry and my mind was racing. I wanted to put as many miles as possible between me and that village. I told myself I would come back in the daytime, maybe with more people, so I wouldn't be alone. For now, I had enough information for a preliminary report. Empty houses, boarded-up windows, signs of past habitation, and that strange building with an office full of old paperwork. I was still thinking about the iron box I left on that shelf. Part of me wanted to know what was inside, but I wasn't about to risk staying there any longer. I reached the main road and breathed a little easier. I could see the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. My heart was still pounding, but I felt relief creeping in. I told myself that once I got home, I'd organize the notes and try to figure out who owned that property and why it was left to rot. Maybe there was a simple explanation for the entire village being deserted. Maybe it had to do with zoning issues or some economic collapse. But those faceless figures didn't fit into any logical scenario I could think of. I passed the lake on my left. The water looked dark and still. A few small waves lapped at the shore. I caught a glimpse of the moon's reflection on the surface. I thought about the breeze earlier, the one that carried the scent of stagnant water through the empty streets. I realized I hadn't heard any birds or frogs near the lake. It all felt wrong. At that moment, I shivered. The hair on my arm stood up again. My shoulders were tense and my lower back ached from how rigid I'd been since I arrived. I gripped the wheel tighter, pressing my foot on the gas. I just wanted to be out of that area. The truck bumped along the road as I tried to put distance behind me. My headlights cut a path in the dark, revealing nothing but empty fields and the occasional tree. Every once in a while, I glanced in the mirror, feeling paranoid. Eventually, I merged onto a more familiar road with a single dim streetlight. I rolled down the window to get some fresh air. The outside breeze felt cool against my face, but I still couldn't relax. I didn't want to dwell on the sight of those gray figures. I kept cycling through possibilities. Maybe squatters wearing some kind of protective suits, or illusions caused by shadows. But it didn't make sense how they moved or how they vanished without a trace. Every time I tried to rationalize it, my stomach twisted. By the time I reached a small convenience store on the outskirts of the next town, I pulled over. I parked under the bright lights and felt a wave of relief. I sat there for a moment, letting myself breathe. My body felt drained, like I had run a marathon. I stepped out and stretched my legs. A few moths fluttered around the overhead lamps. I couldn't get the image of those blank faces out of my head. I rubbed my eyes and checked my phone again. Still no service. Maybe the area was just a dead zone. I got back in the truck and stared through the windshield. The light above me was buzzing softly. I looked at the folder of papers on the passenger seat. My boss would want a full report, but how could I explain the part about the figures without sounding like I was losing it? I decided I would keep it factual. The place is abandoned, houses are boarded up. No signs of recent habitation except for some old rags here and there. I wouldn't mention the strange sightings. At least, not until I had more evidence. Right then, I just wanted to get home and shake off the feeling of that silent village. I turned the key again, pulled out of the parking lot, and headed toward the highway. As I drove, I kept glancing at the shadows on the side of the road. I listened for any strange sounds, but all I heard was the hum of my engine. The tension in my shoulders started to ease, but the memory was still fresh. I felt like I needed a shower, some food, and a good night's sleep. I wasn't sure if I'd have nightmares or if I'd just pass out from exhaustion. One thing was clear. I'd never forget that village, the boarded-up windows, and the two figures slipping away behind that wall. I don't know if they were real or not. All I know is that I saw something and that I couldn't find them afterward. The place felt hollow, like it had been abandoned for a reason. I kept telling myself that when I returned, it would be in broad daylight, with a crew, and I'd have a better plan. But a part of me wasn't sure if I even wanted to go back. The image of those blank faces and gray silhouettes would stick with me, no matter what explanation I tried to come up with. That was the longest ride home I've ever had. I still can't forget the silence and how it pressed on my ears. I don't think I ever will. I'll be straight about this. I live in an old building with thick walls and narrow corridors. Most tenants keep to themselves, and I've always done the same. For a while, I thought the biggest problem here was the erratic plumbing or the flickering lights in the hallways. Then the noises started at night. They weren't random clanks or creaks. They were low and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat pulsing through the floors, especially around 3 in the morning. I tried to ignore it at first, but it got under my skin. It made me feel watched even when I was alone in my living room. 2 nights ago, I decided I'd had enough. I couldn't sleep, and I wanted to figure out what was happening in the basement, because that's where the noise seemed to come from. People here rarely talk about that place, and I've always avoided going down there. But at 3 in the morning, half awake and annoyed, I took my flashlight and my keys and I headed for the basement door. I'm a 35-year-old guy, pretty normal, a bit taller than average. I don't like messing around with creepy stuff, and I'm not big on ghost stories. But the sound that night felt way too real to ignore. It was a steady thump-thump, like a drum in a distant room. My first thought was that some piece of machinery was malfunctioning, but I couldn't shake the sensation that it was more organic than mechanical. The staircase to the basement is behind a plain metal door near the elevator. That door is usually locked, but I have a key because each tenant is supposed to keep one. Most people lose theirs or forget they have it. I found mine buried in the back of a drawer in my kitchen. The door creaked when I opened it, and the corridor behind it smelled stale. I aimed my flashlight into the darkness, and I saw a narrow set of steps going down. The walls in that stairwell had chipped paint, and I noticed small chunks missing here and there. The noise was louder there. It had a muffled rhythm that made the hair on my arms stand up. I closed the door behind me because I couldn't stand the idea of leaving it open. It felt wrong to block my only exit, but it also felt wrong to leave that door gaping at my back. When I took the first step down, my foot slid a little on something wet. I leaned down and ran my fingertips over the stair. It felt damp, like the surface had been sweating. The smell of mold and old water hit my nose hard. I coughed and covered my mouth for a second. I took each step slowly. My flashlight beam shook because my hand wouldn't stay steady. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became. I felt moisture clinging to my skin and my shirt stuck to my back. I heard the drip of water somewhere below, a steady tap against the concrete floor. The rhythmic sound I'd heard from my apartment seemed to vibrate through the walls around me. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found a hallway that stretched in both directions. The walls there looked grimy. Dark green moss spread across them in thick patches, and there were wet spots that glistened under my flashlight. The floor was slick, and I had to walk carefully to avoid slipping. I decided to turn left, because the heartbeat-like sound was louder that way. My flashlight beam flickered and I tapped it. I was worried it might die on me. The hallway had no functioning lights that I could see. I noticed closed doors on both sides, some made of old wood, others metal. Most had rusted doorknobs. 1 or 2 were slightly ajar, but I didn't feel any breeze or movement. It was silent except for my footsteps, the dripping water, and that steady thump echoing through the walls. As I moved forward, I saw something on the wall at my shoulder height. They were handprints, clear outlines in the wet moss. I held my flashlight closer. The handprints looked about the same size as mine, with fingers spread. I touched one of them, and the moss felt slimy. My hand came away with green residue and I wiped it on my jeans. Seeing those prints made my chest tighten. They were spaced out every few feet, like someone had placed their palms along the wall, step by step. My heart was pounding, and I realized it was almost in sync with the noise. It freaked me out. I told myself it was just the tension messing with my pulse, but each time I heard that thump, my chest seemed to respond. I kept walking, checking the doors to see if any were obviously open. Most were locked. Some had metal bars or old padlocks that looked rusted shut. A couple of doors had chipped paint with lettering that had faded long ago. I couldn't tell what they once said. I finally reached the end of the hallway and it led into a larger open space. My flashlight showed a wide, low-ceilinged room. The walls were concrete and covered in thick moss. The floor was uneven and there were puddles of murky water. The air felt thick and I could taste the dampness on my tongue. In that room, the rhythmic noise was stronger. It came from somewhere beyond the back wall. The sound was a steady pulse, like a slow, forceful beat. I scanned the room and saw old storage boxes stacked against one wall. They were falling apart, and I could see black stains on the cardboard. I noticed metal shelves with tools that looked ancient. A rusted hammer, a twisted screwdriver, a couple of old rags. Everything had a layer of mildew. The smell reminded me of a soaked basement after a flood, but this felt worse. The air was stagnant, like no one had opened these doors in decades. I stepped farther into the room. My foot splashed in a small puddle. The water was cold and soaked through my sneaker. I felt my toes curl inside the shoe, and it made me grit my teeth. The dripping sound echoed louder there, each drop causing a slight ripple on the floor. I passed the shelves, careful not to bump them. My flashlight beam swept across the far corner, and I spotted a doorway that was partially blocked by a collapsed piece of shelving. It looked like someone had tried to move it out of the way but gave up. I crept over to the blocked doorway, trying not to slip. The pulse-like sound was definitely coming from behind that door. I tried pushing the shelving aside, but it barely budged. It felt waterlogged and weighed down by debris. I pushed again, using my shoulder. The metal screeched across the concrete. I managed to create just enough space to squeeze past it. My clothes scraped against wet metal and I felt a gritty texture against my arm. The doorway led into a narrow tunnel-like corridor. The walls were closer together here, and my shoulders brushed against damp concrete if I turned too far to either side. The sound was much louder. It was a powerful thump that made the floor vibrate under my feet. The hallway was pitch black beyond my flashlight's beam. My breathing was quick and I could feel sweat on my forehead. I had this urge to turn back and pretend I never heard anything, but the sound felt like it was calling me forward. I kept walking. After maybe 30 steps, I saw an opening at the end. It was a small chamber. The walls had deep cracks and water leaked from them in thin streams. The floor there was covered in muddy water up to my ankles. The flashlight reflected off the surface, showing clusters of algae and broken tiles underneath. I saw more handprints on the walls, and they were all at about the same height. Some overlapped each other, as if they'd been pressed in different times. My name echoed through the space. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I froze and aimed the flashlight around, trying to catch any movement. I called out once. My voice shook. I said my own name, as if to confirm I heard it right. For a moment, there was no response. Then I heard it again, soft, like a whisper bouncing off the dripping walls. My stomach tightened. I felt a rush of cold anxiety move up my spine. I took a few more steps, shining my light around the room. There was no one there. The only thing I saw was a far wall with several holes, probably for drainage or old pipes. The pulsing sound felt like it was coming from all sides now. My flashlight started flickering again. I tried smacking the flashlight against my palm. Then I saw movement in the corner. I jerked the light that way, but there was nothing but wet concrete. My name echoed again. It felt close. I started talking in a low voice, telling whatever was there to show itself. I didn't have a plan if something appeared, but I was too scared to stay quiet. My heartbeat was thumping in my ears and my breath was shallow. The handprints on the wall caught my attention again. I noticed that some of them had deeper impressions, like whoever pressed them did it with force. The prints were the same general shape as mine, but the idea that someone had been pressing their palms into this slimy moss made my skin crawl. I looked at my own hand and lined it up with one of the prints. It matched almost exactly. I yanked my hand away and felt my chest tighten again. I heard my name a fourth time. The whisper was right behind me, like warm breath on my ear. I spun around and nearly slipped in the muddy water. My flashlight beam went wild across the walls, but I saw no figure. I yelled, asking who was there. My voice echoed, mixing with dripping water and that pulsating sound. My eyes darted around the chamber. There wasn't a single shape or outline of a person. I only saw the cracks in the walls, the moss, and the puddles. At that point, my nerves were shot. I wanted to leave. I moved toward the corridor I came from, but the pulsing suddenly stopped. The silence was suffocating. I stood there with my breath rasping in my throat, waiting for another noise. Then I heard a slow scrape against the wall behind me. I turned around again, but still saw nothing. My name came once more, softer than before, trailing off into the silence. I inched backward, keeping my flashlight aimed in front of me. My thoughts were jumbled. My mind was telling me I might be losing it, but my body was screaming to get out. The water splashed around my ankles. Then something brushed against my leg. I jumped and swung the flashlight. I saw a piece of mossy debris float by. I realized I was shaking. My arms felt weak, and my knees felt ready to buckle. I forced myself to walk back through the narrow corridor. Every few steps I looked over my shoulder, half expecting someone to appear. The pulsing sound didn't start again. It was quiet now, except for my soggy footsteps and the dripping water. My breath echoed in my own ears. When I reached the blocked doorway, I squeezed past the shelving again. A jagged edge ripped a small tear in my jacket sleeve. I cursed under my breath but kept going. I crossed the large, low-ceilinged room at a fast pace. The flashlight flickered, and I prayed it wouldn't go out. I could see my footprints in the wet floor behind me, but I didn't slow down to examine them. My mouth tasted bitter from adrenaline and fear. My mind was on one thing, getting back upstairs. When I returned to the hallway with all the locked doors, I noticed fresh handprints on the walls, still dripping. They looked new, like someone had just placed them there. My stomach flipped and I pushed forward, not caring about the noise I made. I stumbled a few times on the slick floor, but I steadied myself against the wall, ignoring the slimy texture. My heart was racing and my breath was fast. I made it to the stairs. Climbing them felt like running a marathon. My legs felt heavy and my lungs burned from the stale air. I reached the metal door and fumbled with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped them once. They clanked on the floor. The echo in the stairwell was harsh. I grabbed the keys, shoved the right one into the lock, and twisted. The door opened. I slipped through it and slammed it shut behind me. I stood in the corridor by the elevator, breathing hard. My clothes were soaked in places and I smelled like moss and stale water. My flashlight was still in my hand, but it was off now, and my finger was shaking on the switch. My entire body felt wired. I glanced around, half expecting to hear that pulsating sound again. But it was quiet. The hallway lights were dim and flickering. I felt relief just seeing something familiar. I walked to my apartment, locked the door, and tossed my flashlight on the couch. My nerves were shot. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my breathing. The refrigerator hummed, and the clock on my wall read close to 4 in the morning. I listened for any noises from below. All I heard was the hum of the building's old electricity, but I couldn't stop thinking about the basement. The memory of my name whispered from the darkness stayed with me. I checked my arms and legs. I was covered in filth, and there was a small cut on my elbow. I washed it in the sink with warm water and soap, trying not to think about what I had just seen. I was worried about infection from that murky water, so I dried it carefully and put a bandage on it. Then I walked to my bedroom. I sat on the edge of my bed, not bothering to change my jeans or jacket. My windows faced the street, and I could see the faint glow of the streetlights. I stayed there, listening, waiting for any sign of that pulse starting again. It didn't. Eventually, the exhaustion set in. I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. The next day, I tried to act normal, but I felt off. I kept thinking about those mossy walls, the footprints in the muddy water, the blocked doorway, and the way my name echoed in the dark. I don't understand how it happened, and I don't know who or what I expected to find there. But I know I'm not going back in a hurry. Something down there called to me and I answered, even though I found nothing but more questions. I've been listening for the noise again. So far, I haven't heard it, but I'm on edge. I keep the basement key in my pocket. I'm not sure if I plan to throw it away or hold on to it in case the pulsing sound returns. For now, I'm just trying to keep my routine. I turn up the TV volume at night. I leave a lamp on in the living room, but I can't shake the feeling that the basement isn't done with me. And if I ever hear that steady thump-thump again, I'm not sure I'll have the courage to ignore it. I felt a jolt of adrenaline the moment I heard that voice near my boat. I'd been out at sea for several days and everything had been quiet, just the usual sounds of water shifting against the hull and my own footsteps on the deck. Then that humming started. It sounded like it came from right on the surface of the water, but I couldn't see anybody. My heart thumped faster. My eyes darted across the waves and there was no other boat in sight. I was out there alone, or at least I had been until that noise broke the silence. I'd been fishing in a small single-engine craft I borrowed from a friend. It's nothing fancy, just a white boat with chipped paint along the sides and a narrow cabin that holds a bunk, a small table, and some storage space. The engine sputters sometimes, but it runs well enough to get me out into deeper waters. I had enough supplies to last a week. I'd done this routine plenty of times. Spend a few days away from shore, catch what I could, and come back when I had a decent haul. I usually enjoyed the isolation. It's calmer out there, and there's no crowd. The only other living things were the fish, a few birds, and maybe a whale in the distance. But on that particular evening, the ocean felt different. Earlier that day, I got up before dawn. My back hurt because the bunk is too narrow and the mattress is worn out. I stretched my legs, scratched at my stubbly chin, and headed up to check my lines. The water was dark, but I could see some silver reflections whenever a wave rose under the moonlight. I pulled in a small catch, mostly mackerel, a couple of bigger fish that put up a fight. I gutted them and stored them in ice. The routine made me relax for a while. My mind wandered, and I found myself glancing at the horizon. Nothing seemed out of place. Around midday, I started feeling the heat. The sun was pounding on my shoulders, and my forehead was dripping sweat. I had a ragged baseball cap, so I put it on to keep the sun from blinding me. I drank a lot of water, but my throat still felt dry. The engine was off, and the boat drifted a bit. I sometimes like turning the engine off to save fuel and listen to the water. It helps me think straight and plan my next move. The day felt lazy and slow until late afternoon. Then the sun began to sink. The sky turned orange. The temperature was still high, but the light changed. Shadows stretched across the deck. I noticed the wind had died down. The air was thick, and my shirt clung to my chest. That's when I first heard the humming. It was faint at first. It sounded almost like a low whistle. I looked up thinking maybe a breeze had kicked up, but there was no wind. The ocean surface was calm. The humming started and stopped. I stood up and leaned over the side of the boat. I didn't see anything. I figured maybe it was an echo of my own thoughts after being alone for days. Sometimes you hear your own voice in your head when there's nobody else to talk to. So I shrugged and went back to recheck my lines. That's when the sound got louder, like someone humming a short tune right behind my ears. I spun around, but I saw only water. My heart pounded. I scoured the horizon. Nothing. No ship, no raft, no sign of another person. I shouted, "Hello? Anyone there?" But I only heard my own echo. A small wave slapped the hull. The boat rocked a bit. I tried to calm down by focusing on something practical. I decided to pull up my anchor and reposition, maybe set up somewhere else. But before I could move, the humming started again, a bit stronger, almost like singing. The voice sounded soft, definitely human, but I couldn't identify any words. It was just a melodic humming, up and down, repeating a few notes. I clenched my jaw. My chest felt tight. I kept looking around, expecting to see a head pop up from behind a wave. Nothing showed up. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned every direction. I didn't see a single ship. I didn't even see a seagull at that moment. It was as if the sea itself was humming. I'd heard stories about weird sounds over open water, how certain currents or wind patterns could produce noises. But the air was still, and the water was too calm for waves to make that kind of sound. I felt a knot in my stomach. I decided to move to another spot and see if the noise followed me. I cranked the engine and turned the boat about 50 yards. The humming faded for a moment. I exhaled in relief. I told myself it might have been some trick of my imagination. Then out of nowhere I heard it again, louder this time. My hands started trembling on the wheel. I kept turning, but the sound circled around me. It came from the left, then behind me, then from the right. I didn't like the way it made me feel. There was a chill on my skin despite the heat. Goosebumps spread across my arms and a shiver ran down my spine. It felt like someone was brushing cold air against my neck, even though the air outside was thick and warm. I didn't want to show fear, even though there was no one around to see me. I tried distracting myself by focusing on the tasks at hand. I double-checked the engine temperature, the fuel gauge, and the fish storage. My hands felt sweaty on the gear shift. The humming would fade, then come back. My head started pounding. My mouth felt dry, and I kept swallowing. I had the urge to shout again, but I was worried about what might respond. By the time the sun was dipping below the horizon, I was soaked in sweat. The orange light spread across the sky, and the water caught that color. Everything looked tinted in a dark, rusty glow. I finally decided to anchor for the night, because I didn't want to drive in the dark while feeling on edge. I dropped the anchor and turned off the engine. The humming faded for a while. My ears started ringing from the silence. I forced myself to eat some crackers and canned tuna. I could barely taste anything. My jaw stayed tight, and my tongue felt thick. I forced the food down and drank some water. The meal did nothing to calm my nerves. Darkness settled in, and the stars came out. Usually I find that comforting because I can navigate by the brightest stars if my instruments fail. But this time they felt distant, and the sky seemed bigger than usual. The boat creaked as it swayed in gentle waves. I scanned the horizon again. Still no lights, no other boats. I set my radio to different channels, listening for chatter. It was just static and occasional faint signals I couldn't understand. I switched it off and sat quietly in the cabin, trying to breathe slowly. The inside of the boat was cramped, and the single light bulb above my head buzzed. I felt claustrophobic, so I stepped outside to get some fresh air. That's when I heard the humming again. It came from behind the boat this time. I whipped around. My pulse hammered in my ears. I walked to the railing, leaned over, and stared down at the water. I saw nothing. The surface was dark, with a bit of reflection from the moonlight. My breath got shallow. I forced myself to inhale through my nose and exhale through my mouth. I gripped the railing with both hands, trying to ground myself. I said, "Stop, this isn't real," under my breath. But it didn't stop. The singing rose in volume, a gentle tune but impossible to ignore. It moved to my left, then to my right. My head spun. I felt a stab of panic in my chest. I pictured the possibility of someone swimming around, messing with me. But how could they stay hidden? There wasn't any splash or shadow. The water looked empty. I started pacing across the deck. My stomach churned. My eyes burned from staring into the darkness. Sweat trickled down my forehead. I wiped it away, but it kept coming. I pulled out a flashlight and shone it across the surface. The beam of light caught little specks of foam and small ripples, but no silhouette, no hand, no face. The humming persisted. My breathing got heavier. My mind raced. I wondered if the sound was coming from inside my own head. I'd heard stories about isolation messing with people's senses, but it felt real. I was certain I heard it outside my boat. I didn't sleep much that night. I tried lying in my bunk, but every time I started to drift off, I heard the humming again. I jerked awake, my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. My throat felt sore, and every muscle in my body tensed up. I felt paranoid, like someone was watching me. I pictured a figure floating near the boat, waiting for me to close my eyes. I sat up. I tried the radio again, got nothing, turned it off. I listened to the gentle waves bump the hull. For an hour or two, the humming stopped. I closed my eyes for a moment, but I never fully relaxed. At dawn, I climbed onto the deck. My legs felt shaky. I had a headache from lack of sleep. The morning light usually helps me clear my head, but I still felt uneasy. I started the engine to move to a different area. Maybe the water over there would be different. Maybe I'd get a stronger radio signal. The boat rumbled to life, and I steered east. The sea had a light chop. The sun peaked above the horizon, shining on the waves. It looked peaceful at first. Then I heard it again. The same melody, the same pattern. It sounded closer this time, like it was right beside the boat. My chest tightened. My right hand gripped the wheel and my knuckles turned white. I looked down at the water. I couldn't see any shape or shadow. Just foam streaming past the hull. My breath got ragged, and I felt a wave of nausea in my gut. I gunned the engine a bit, speeding forward. The humming rose in pitch like it was trying to catch up with me. I kept going for a solid hour. The smell of gasoline drifted around as the engine roared. My ears rang from the noise. The wind battered my face and my shirt flapped against my body. After a while, I slowed down to check my compass and position. I realized I'd traveled farther away from my original spot than I'd planned. The humming had stopped again, but I could still feel the tension clinging to me. My hands were slick with sweat, and my heart rate wouldn't settle. I decided I needed to ground myself in some kind of routine, so I set up my fishing gear in this new location. I tried to ignore the memories of that sound. I cast my lines and waited, eyes focused on the water. When the line twitched, I reeled in a decent fish. It flopped around on the deck. I cleaned it, tossed it into the cooler. For a few minutes, I managed to concentrate on normal tasks. I felt my breathing slow. My stomach relaxed. I drank more water and ate a protein bar. My focus returned, and I kept fishing for another hour. Just as I felt somewhat calm, I heard that voice again. It drifted across the surface, starting from behind me. My head snapped around, and I almost dropped my fishing rod. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled over my own feet. The boat rocked from the sudden movement. My pulse thundered in my ears. My throat tightened, and I let out a shaky breath. I tried to tell myself it was some weird echo, or maybe a radio channel interfering. But I'd shut off the radio. The voice seemed to circle me, just like it had before. My hands trembled. I left the rod resting on the side and crept to the bow. I scanned the horizon. Bright daylight made it easier to see, but there was still nothing out there. The water was empty except for a few small waves. No dolphins, no seals, no swimmers. The melody grew clearer. My skin prickled with goosebumps again. I could almost pinpoint the direction, but every time I turned, it seemed to shift. I felt trapped, surrounded by open water, but cornered by that noise. My eyes stung, and I wanted to blink away the tension. My shoulders ached. My heart thumped so hard my chest hurt. I rubbed my face with my palms, trying to snap myself out of it. Then I took a step back, forced some air into my lungs, and grabbed the wheel. I was done with that area. I didn't care about the catch anymore. I just wanted out. I decided to head back to shore even though I didn't have as many fish as I'd wanted. The engine roared again and I turned the boat toward home. The humming persisted for a few minutes, floating in and out of range as if it was coming from the air itself. Eventually, after maybe 20 minutes, it disappeared again. My head still buzzed with the memory of that sound, but I didn't hear it anymore. I focused on the horizon, watching for the faint line of the coast. When I finally spotted land in the distance, I felt my muscles loosen a bit. I glanced back at the water behind me. The sea looked normal, just a wide stretch of blue. I didn't know if that voice was some kind of auditory hallucination or if there was actually someone out there. I just knew I wanted to get away from it. I kept my eyes forward, not wanting to look back. My breathing steadied, and my mind started to clear. My tongue still felt dry and sweat coated my neck. I reached a point where I could see other fishing boats near the coast. The engine rattled as I pushed it to go faster. I passed by a few vessels, but I didn't wave or call out. I just wanted to dock, stand on solid ground, and let my heartbeat return to normal. As soon as I reached the marina, I tied up the boat, jumped onto the pier, and took a deep breath. The world felt stable again, but I couldn't shake the tension in my chest. I emptied my catch, carried my gear to my truck, and sat behind the wheel for a long minute. My hands still trembled, and my forehead was damp. I kept hearing that tune in my head, but there was no one around, just the sound of seagulls by the docks. I drove off, feeling more exhausted than I ever had after a normal fishing trip. I didn't know if I had lost my grip on reality or if I'd actually heard someone out there. But I knew I wasn't ready to go back anytime soon. I just wanted a shower, a cold drink, and a quiet night far from the water. I pulled up to that cabin with a stale sense of relief and curiosity. I had expected a quiet place, but I didn't expect such a heavy stillness all around. There were no other cars, no other people, and I heard nothing except some distant rustling in the trees. The wooden exterior looked old and a bit warped. The windows faced the lake on one side, and on the other side, there was a small porch with a single rocking chair. Everything around me felt muted, like the wind didn't want to bother rustling the leaves too much. As soon as I stepped out of my rental car, I dropped my bag on the ground and walked straight toward the lake. I wanted to see the water up close before I settled into the cabin. The lake was calm, with only a few gentle ripples. The reflection of the cabin reached out across the surface, but something about it looked off. I leaned forward, my shoes right at the edge of the grass where it met the rocky bank. My eyes narrowed on the reflection because I saw windows in different positions than they were in reality. I stepped sideways to check if I was looking at it from a weird angle. No, it definitely wasn't just my angle. I saw closed shutters in the reflection, but the actual cabin didn't have shutters. There was also a thin line of smoke curling up from the roof in the reflection, even though the cabin's chimney was dark and cold. I didn't like that. My stomach tightened, and a dull pressure formed in my chest. I could feel my heartbeat speeding up. I stayed there for a while, just staring. The water was too still for it to be a trick of the ripples. I felt a chill on the back of my neck, like a sudden breeze, but I didn't feel actual wind. It made no sense to me. I decided to step back and unload my bag. I walked onto the porch, pushed the cabin door open, and took a quick look inside. The interior was small, with a living room area that had an old couch and a coffee table, a fireplace on the opposite wall, and a tiny kitchen off to one side. The bedroom door stood on the left, partially open. The whole place smelled like old wood and stale air. I flicked a light switch, and a dim ceiling lamp buzzed on. The floor creaked under my shoes. Everything seemed normal inside. But I couldn't shake off the weird feeling I got from that reflection. I dropped my duffel bag on the couch and rubbed my arms because I felt a sudden chill, even though it wasn't that cold. I walked over to the fireplace and checked if there was wood. The old stack of logs looked damp, so I figured I wouldn't be lighting anything soon. I realized it was too quiet, so I turned on the kitchen faucet just to hear some running water. The water was brown for a few seconds, then turned clear. At least that worked. I walked to the bedroom and checked the bed. The sheets were thin. I noticed a musty smell, so I opened the window. Outside, the sun was still hovering over the tree line, and the sky had the color of late afternoon. The lake glimmered, and I saw the cabin's reflection again. I leaned over the windowsill and noticed the reflection looked normal for a split second. Then my eyes caught something in the reflection's window on the other side. There was a shadow inside, like someone walking past. I froze, pressing my knuckles against the sill. My mouth felt dry. I stepped away from the window and walked back to the living room. I wanted to open the front door, get some fresh air, and remind myself there was nothing actually strange going on. Outside, the sun was creeping down. The sky was starting to fade. I grabbed a bottle of water from my bag and took a few sips just to calm myself. My body felt tense and my breathing was shallow. I noticed the rocking chair on the porch. I sat down, hoping to feel more relaxed. The chair squeaked quietly under my weight. I stared at the lake, waiting to see if that weird reflection would appear again. The surface of the lake was darker now, but I could still see the shape of the cabin in the water. The windows in the reflection looked shut again, even though the real cabin's windows were definitely open in the bedroom and the living room. I felt goosebumps on my arms. I wondered if I should close all the windows. Maybe I should just ignore it. But every time I looked at the reflection, my stomach twisted. I got up and went inside. I shut the bedroom window and the living room window. I made sure the doors were locked. The lock clicked with a heavy sound. That small action made me feel safer for a moment. Night fell faster than I expected. I checked my phone. No service. I had noticed a small radio on the shelf in the living room, so I tried to turn it on. It crackled but didn't pick up any clear stations. I set it aside and looked for some food. I found a few canned goods in the cupboard. I heated a can of soup on the old gas stove. The flame was weak and flickered every time I shifted the pot. While it warmed, I walked over to the window and glanced outside. The lake looked almost black in the darkness, but there was a faint glimmer in the center of it. It looked like a light, but it was small and dim. I forgot about the soup for a second. I leaned over the sink and stared, trying to figure out if there was a boat out there. But the light didn't move across the water. It stayed at the spot where the reflection of the cabin would be. It was like a single lamp shining behind a window, except it was in the middle of the lake. I felt my heartbeat slam in my chest. My hands started sweating. I gripped the counter and held my breath. Then the stove made a popping sound, and I jumped. I realized the soup was about to boil over, so I turned off the flame. I filled a small bowl and sat at the tiny kitchen table. I kept the overhead light off, hoping to see the lake more clearly. My eyes adjusted, and I could still see that faint glow out there on the water. It never flickered, never moved around. It was a steady glow. I ate my soup with quick, shallow breaths, trying to calm down. Each spoonful tasted bland. My mind was locked on that glow. I kept thinking about the reflection from earlier and how it didn't match the cabin. My stomach felt tight. After finishing the soup, I left the bowl in the sink and grabbed a flashlight from my bag. I walked out the front door onto the porch. The night air was chilly. The wind was almost silent. The flashlight cut a narrow beam across the ground, showing me the path that led to the lake. I took a few steps forward, staying on the dirt path, until I was just a few feet from the water's edge. The glow was there, about 30 yards out on the water. It was about the height of a window if I imagined it on the side of a cabin. But there was no cabin in the middle of the lake, just water. I felt an urge to call out, but I didn't know who or what I would be calling to. My mouth felt too dry to speak anyway. I pointed the flashlight toward the lake, but the beam just cut across the surface and revealed nothing special, just dark water. The glow remained separate from my light, as if it existed on another layer. My legs felt shaky and my breathing got shallow again. I decided to head back inside. I locked the door again and turned on every light in the cabin. The living room, kitchen, and bedroom lights all glowed with a dull yellow hue. I stood in the center of the living room, listening to the low buzz from the overhead bulb. The place felt claustrophobic, and I realized I was actually more nervous with all the lights on. I turned them off except for the living room lamp. Then I tried to relax on the couch. Every few minutes I heard a faint dripping noise outside. It sounded like water dripping from the roof or maybe from a nearby tree. My ears were so alert to every sound. I started noticing the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I noticed the way the couch cushions squeaked when I shifted my weight. I noticed how the cabin walls felt thinner than I'd like I could almost sense the darkness pressing against them from outside. At some point I dozed off. I woke up with a start when I realized I had let my head sag back and closed my eyes. I immediately looked at the windows. They were still shut. Everything was still locked. I glanced at my phone. The time read past midnight. The battery was at 50% and there was no signal. I got up, feeling a need to check outside again. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly opened the door. A soft wind brushed against my face when I stepped onto the porch. I shined the light out. The reflection on the lake was different now. I couldn't see the faint glow from earlier. Instead, I noticed something else. It looked like the reflection was slightly closer to the shore. That made no sense. My throat felt tight, and I swallowed hard. I stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward the water. My arms felt stiff and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was so tense that my shoulders ached. When I reached the edge, I aimed the flashlight. The water was calm. The reflection of the cabin was still there, and it looked so close that I felt like if I reached out, I could touch it. The windows in the reflection were lit up, but the actual cabin behind me had only one light on in the living room. It made no sense. I turned around to confirm. The cabin behind me was mostly dark except for that one lamp in the living room window, but the reflection showed multiple lights on, and I could see the outline of closed shutters. I noticed faint smoke drifting up from the chimney in that reflection, but the real chimney stood cold against the starry sky. My breathing got erratic. I felt a pounding in my ears. I took a step back, but the water's surface rippled slightly. When it did, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection. Something moved in the lit window, like a figure passing by inside. I dropped the flashlight for a second, and it rolled on the ground, the beam shaking over the rocks. My mind was yelling at me to back away, to get inside and lock the door. But I also felt an odd pull, like if I waited a moment longer, I might see something more. I forced myself to pick up the flashlight and back up. I half-jogged to the porch, checking over my shoulder as I went. Inside the cabin, I slammed the door and locked it again. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel my ribs ache. I looked out the living room window. I could only see darkness. No sign of the reflection from that angle. My mind raced with thoughts. I wondered if I should leave right then, but it was past midnight, and I had no idea if I could navigate the dirt roads out here in the dark. I glanced at my car parked near the cabin. It didn't look comforting. The surrounding trees were thick and the path was narrow. I decided to wait until morning. I went to the bedroom, turned on the lamp on the bedside table, and closed the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed. My legs were restless and I kept bouncing my knee. I turned off the lamp and tried to lie down, but I kept picturing that reflection with the lit windows. After maybe half an hour of tossing and turning, I grabbed my phone, opened the bedroom door, and walked back to the living room. I didn't want to be alone in that bedroom. I tried sitting on the couch again. I kept the living room lamp on, and I listened to the quiet. I felt isolated and trapped by my own anxiety. I told myself I just needed to make it to dawn. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch. When I opened my eyes again, the room was dimly lit by early morning light filtering through the windows. I sat up fast and checked the time on my phone. It was just after 6. The tension in my body was still there, but the daylight made me feel a little braver. I walked outside onto the porch. The lake looked normal under the morning light. The reflection of the cabin was still visible, but it matched more closely. No shutters were closed. No smoke was rising. I felt a rush of relief in my chest. I decided to gather my things right away. I packed up my bag, grabbed my keys, and locked the cabin behind me. As I walked to the car, I glanced at the lake one last time. I could still see the shape of the cabin in the water, but it looked harmless in the daylight. I opened the car door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I began driving down the narrow dirt road, not looking back. My heart was still pounding from the memories of that strange night. I just wanted to get out of there. I drove carefully, feeling the bumps in the road, hearing the gravel crunch under the tires. My thoughts were a mess, but I focused on the drive, keeping my eyes on the path. I saw the lake shrink in my rearview mirror until it was gone behind the trees. My shoulders slowly relaxed and I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't see any other cars on the way back to the main road. I followed the path until I hit smooth pavement. Then I pressed the gas a bit harder, eager to leave that place far behind. My body felt drained, but I was also on edge. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something impossible behind me. But there was nothing except empty road. I never got answers about that reflection. I didn't tell anyone about it on the way home. I just wanted to forget. But even now, thinking about it makes my chest feel tight. I remember the way the cabin looked in the reflection. Wrong windows, dark shutters, smoke that shouldn't be there. At night, that weird glow out on the water felt like a lure. It felt like something wanted me to come closer. I still get a knot in my stomach when I think about it. I didn't go back. I haven't told many people about it. And I have no plans to see that lake ever again. I never planned on taking over some old house from a distant relative I barely knew. When I got the official letter, I had mixed feelings. Part of me was curious, but another part was uneasy, because the place had been sealed off for decades. I told myself I would go there, take a quick look, and decide what to do. I didn't expect to find anything interesting. I definitely didn't expect to find the mirror. I arrived on a cloudy afternoon. The front yard looked like no one had touched it for years. The grass was overgrown and I saw weeds poking through cracked paving stones. The paint on the walls was peeling and the windows were dusty. I stood on the porch for a moment with the key in my hand. When I pushed the key into the lock, it took me a few tries to get it to turn. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The smell of old, stale air hit me right away. It was like walking into a storage room that hadn't been aired out for a long time. I walked into the main hallway. I flipped a light switch, but nothing happened. I tried another switch next to it. Still nothing. I took out my phone and used its flashlight to look around. The floors creaked under my shoes. I saw thick layers of dust on every surface. Some old furniture stood against the walls. An armchair with faded fabric, a small table with a shattered vase, and a bookshelf filled with random knickknacks. I tried the rest of the lights on the ground floor, but the electricity seemed dead everywhere. I decided to check the upstairs. The staircase felt solid, but each step let out a loud groan. I held the handrail, which was caked in dust. The upper hallway had a few closed doors. One led to a bedroom with a bed frame, a sagging mattress, and some empty boxes on the floor. Another door was locked. At the end of the hallway, a narrow door led to the attic. Its wooden handle was loose, and I had to twist it carefully. I stepped into the attic space. The ceiling was low, and I had to watch my head around the rafters. Dust floated in the air, and the smell up there was heavier, like old books or moth-eaten fabric. I scanned the place with my phone's flashlight and saw piles of boxes, broken chairs, a stack of rotting blankets, and a trunk with missing hinges. In the far corner, there was a sheet covering something tall. It looked like a piece of furniture at first, but it had a strange shape. I felt a slight chill run down my arms. I moved closer and stood there, eyeing the sheet. My pulse picked up. I didn't know why I felt nervous. It was just some covered object in an old attic. But the closer I got, the heavier my breathing became. I told myself I was being foolish. I reached out and pulled the sheet down. Underneath was a mirror with a worn, carved wooden frame. It looked ornate, but most of the details on the frame were chipped or cracked. I shined my light on it and saw my reflection, though the glass was grimy and dim. As soon as I looked at it, I thought I heard something like a whisper. It was low and rough, like someone struggling to form words. It said my name. I froze and looked around, aiming my phone's flashlight at every corner. I didn't see anyone. My mouth went dry. The air felt heavier, and I noticed my heart pounding against my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination. but I still felt on edge. I turned back to the mirror. My own reflection stared back, but I had a strange feeling that the eyes in the glass looked dull, almost lifeless. I leaned in closer. I started to wonder if the glass was warped, but as I tilted my head, the reflection's expression shifted in a way that didn't match mine. I jerked my head back. My stomach tightened. I turned my head from side to side. My reflection in the mirror did the same thing, but it felt slightly off, like it was delayed by a fraction of a second. My breaths got faster. I tried to calm myself by blinking a few times. I heard that voice again, a little clearer this time. It muttered my name with a deep, raspy tone. "Paul," it said. The voice seemed to come from the mirror itself. I stepped back, feeling my legs tense. I tried to control my breathing. I wanted to get out of the attic, but I also felt an urge to keep watching. My hands were sweating. I wiped them on my pants. I reached out and touched the frame. The wood felt rough, like it was rotting in some spots. I expected dust, but it seemed oddly clean along the edges of the frame. I brushed my fingers across the top edge and felt small carvings that I couldn't make out right away. Something about them felt unnatural. My phone's flashlight flickered for a second, which made me jump. The attic seemed darker after that. I forced myself to speak out loud. I said, "Hello?" My voice sounded shaky. I felt a bit foolish talking to a mirror, but that's what I did. I waited, but I heard nothing. I swallowed hard and turned to go back down to the hallway. As I reached the attic door, I felt a small vibration in the floor, like someone had stepped behind me. I spun around quickly, holding my phone out. The mirror stood there, silent. My reflection was faint, barely visible in the dim light. I blinked, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw those eyes shift again, following me. My nerves were on edge. I left the attic and closed the door behind me. I walked downstairs, my steps quicker than before. My chest felt tight, and I realized I was breathing through my mouth. Once I was in the main hall, I opened a couple of windows to let in some fresh air. It was a relief to feel a slight breeze on my face. I thought about leaving the house right then, but I told myself I should at least check the rest of the rooms on the ground floor. I walked into a small dining room. A heavy wooden table stood in the center with 4 chairs around it. There was a sideboard with some dusty plates and cups. Nothing seemed unusual, just old and neglected. I tapped on the walls, flipped through a few papers scattered on top of the sideboard, and found nothing that stood out. I looked at the living room next. There was a fireplace with a few logs still inside, a couple of armchairs, and a couch that had seen better days. Still no electricity, so the place was dark. I moved on to the kitchen. The fridge was empty and smelled stale. The faucet gave one spurt of brown water when I tried it. I opened the cabinets. Some contained canned goods long past their expiration date. Others held old pots and pans. I didn't see anything that caught my attention. The tension in my body started to ease a bit. Maybe I had imagined that voice. Maybe I was just on edge because the house was so old and quiet. But I kept thinking about the mirror. I decided I would go back up there, just to be sure of what I saw. I knew I might regret it, but I couldn't help myself. So I climbed the stairs again, slower this time, and headed to the attic. My flashlight revealed the same dusty piles of junk. The sheet lay crumpled on the floor next to the mirror. I approached it. It looked the same, except the glass seemed clearer than before. I shined my phone on it and saw my face. My reflection looked normal at first glance. Then, out of nowhere, I thought I saw my reflection grin. But my own lips were pressed tight. I felt a chill creep across my skin. I checked my expression in real time, twisting my mouth, raising my eyebrows, trying to match what I saw. The reflection kept pace, except for a slight lag that I noticed when I looked straight at the eyes. They didn't sparkle. They looked like they belonged to someone else. My stomach felt like it was in knots. I leaned in and tried to see if there was any marking on the mirror that could explain this. The surface felt smooth, but the wooden frame had weird symbols carved into it. They looked like random shapes, not letters I recognized. They were scratched into the wood in a crude way, as if someone used a sharp knife. Some lines crossed each other, and there were small half-circle shapes. My head started throbbing. I wiped sweat from my forehead. I took a deep breath. My chest felt tight again. I wanted to see if I could move the mirror, but it was heavy. The frame felt sturdier than I expected. I tried to pull it away from the wall, but it barely budged. I let it go and stepped back. At that moment, I heard the voice again, clearer than before. "Paul," it said, like it was trying to get my attention. My body tensed and the hair on my arms stood up. It felt like someone was standing right behind me, speaking into my ear. I spun around, but I was alone. My mind raced. I thought about covering the mirror again. I grabbed the sheet from the floor and tossed it over the top. As soon as it covered the glass, the voice stopped. I listened carefully, waiting. The only sound I heard was my own breathing. My heart was racing, and I felt a pulse in my neck. I just stood there for a while, holding my phone in one hand and the sheet in the other, unsure what to do next. I finally decided to leave. I headed downstairs, turned off my phone flashlight to save battery, and walked outside into the overcast afternoon. The air smelled fresher out there. My lungs felt like they could expand properly again. I leaned against the porch railing for a moment. My thoughts were all over the place. That mirror looked like it had some strange influence. The voice definitely said my name. I realized my hands were shaking. I forced myself to take a few deep breaths. I went to my car and sat in the driver's seat. I watched the house through the windshield. It looked just like any neglected old building, nothing special on the outside. I thought about driving back to my apartment and never setting foot in this place again. But something pulled at me. It felt like I should deal with the mirror somehow. Maybe I could store it somewhere else or get rid of it entirely. But my gut tightened at the idea of even touching it again. I decided to stay a bit longer. I figured I should at least try to contact an electrician or someone to help check the power. I thought maybe with proper lighting, I wouldn't feel so jumpy. I called the first number I found online. A guy said he could come the next day to look at the wiring. That was fine. I didn't plan on sleeping there, but I wanted to see if the place had any big issues before I made a final decision about selling or keeping it. I got out of the car and walked around to the backyard. There was an old tool shed near the fence. I tried the door, but it was locked. I looked through a window and saw some rusty tools and a couple of paint cans. Nothing looked worth the trouble right then. I circled back to the house. I opened a few more windows on the ground floor to let air circulate. The rooms felt calmer with a bit more light. When I stepped back into the hallway, I realized I was avoiding the attic. I kept glancing up the staircase, half expecting to see something peering over the railing. My mouth felt dry again, so I walked to the kitchen to see if the faucet would give me any water now. It still sputtered with a bit of rust-colored water, but it ran clear after a minute. I cupped my hands and drank a little. The water tasted metallic, but it helped. Then I shut it off. I heard a soft thump above me. It came from the second floor. My body stiffened. My pulse hammered in my ears. I tried to brush it off as the house settling. The place was old and the wood could pop and crack, but the sound repeated, a light knock or shuffle. I moved into the hallway, my eyes on the ceiling. Then it stopped. My breathing was shallow and I tried to focus on staying calm. My palms were sweating again. I decided I wasn't going back to the attic. At least not alone. My nerves were shot. That mirror was on my mind and I couldn't deal with another strange experience right then. I locked up the house, made sure all the windows I'd opened were closed again, and walked to my car. I kept expecting to hear footsteps or that voice, but nothing happened. The whole house felt silent, like it was waiting. I drove away and told myself I'd return the next day with the electrician. I wanted someone else there, even if he had no idea what was going on. I needed another person in the house with me. As I left, I looked in the rearview mirror at the house behind me. The windows on the second floor seemed dark, like hollow eyes. The attic window was barely visible. I stared at it while driving off. I caught myself gripping the steering wheel too tight. On the way home, I replayed everything in my head. The dusty attic, the cracked frame, the carved symbols. Mostly, I kept thinking about that reflection with those blank eyes and the voice that spoke my name. My gut tightened each time I remembered it. I felt a cold sweat on my back. I got back to my apartment late in the evening. I tossed my keys on the kitchen counter and went straight to the shower. I stood under the hot water trying to push those images out of my head, but they kept popping back. When I tried to sleep that night, I kept hearing that low voice in my mind, calling me. It was almost like a scratchy echo. My brain wouldn't settle down. I told myself I needed to figure out what to do with that mirror. I didn't want to keep it, but I also didn't want to leave it there. My heartbeat stayed fast for a long time before I finally drifted off. That's how I ended up here telling you this. This mirror isn't normal. I'm certain of that. There's something in that frame, something that feels alive when you stare into it. I don't know how my relative got hold of it. I don't see any records of a purchase or any notes about it in the house. But it's there, and it seems to be waiting for someone to look at it again. I don't plan on going back alone. I don't feel safe in that place. Not with that thing in the attic. I wish I'd never set eyes on it. But now I have, and the memory won't leave me alone. I slammed the truck door and took one hard look at the old hospital entrance. The place was in the middle of nowhere, with boarded-up windows and rust creeping along the edges of the double doors. My uncle was the caretaker here years ago. Now it was shut down, and we were here to haul out some leftover equipment. I remember thinking something felt off even before we stepped inside. The air outside was cold, but inside it felt stale, like a room that hadn't been opened in a decade. I just wanted to get in and get out. We walked down the main hallway first. Paint was peeling off the walls and the floor tiles were stained. My Uncle Roy said we should check the upper floors for anything that could be sold or recycled, so we climbed some creaky steps. Up there, most of the rooms were empty or had torn mattresses on metal bed frames. Some had old IV poles in the corners. We found a couple of wheelchairs in one room. Their wheels were rusty, but I figured someone might repurpose them. The place smelled damp and I could feel my nose itching. The ceiling tiles in one hallway had caved in, and dusty insulation was scattered around. When I stepped on it, puffs of fine dust rose into the air. We spent about an hour walking room to room. Mostly it was junk. Broken monitors, cracked plastic bins, old cords, and some leftover cleaning supplies. My uncle grumbled about how the hospital got shut down. Something about low funding and not enough patients. Eventually, we loaded some random metal parts and a couple of old stools onto a cart. Then Roy said we should head to the basement, where there might be some oxygen tanks and bigger machinery. I followed him down a back staircase that smelled like mildew. The light switch at the top did nothing, so we used our flashlights. The steps felt slippery, and I held on to the rusted handrail. Roy walked slowly, shining his flashlight ahead so we could see the foot of the stairs. I noticed old pipes running along the ceiling. They made faint dripping sounds in the darkness. The basement door creaked when we opened it. It was a heavy metal door with chipped paint. As soon as we stepped through, the air felt colder. I could see my breath. The basement corridors were long, with a low ceiling and flickering emergency lights that barely worked. Some sections were in complete darkness, so I pointed my flashlight around. My uncle took a left, saying the storage area was somewhere near the old laundry room. While we walked, water dripped from those overhead pipes, hitting the concrete floor with soft taps. I felt tense without really knowing why. Every little sound made me look over my shoulder. Roy didn't say anything, but I could tell he was on edge too. He kept shining his light at random corners. Finally, we found a door labeled storage. Inside were shelves loaded with dusty boxes, extra bed rails, and some large canisters that looked like the oxygen tanks we needed. A few were upright, some were on their sides. We spotted old tags on them that mentioned oxygen or compressed air. Roy said we should bring them up, but first we had to make sure they weren't full or leaking. When I tapped one lightly, it sounded hollow. He started checking the rest, rattling them to see if they held anything. Then he told me we should separate them. empties on one side, partials on the other. While we worked, something clanged in the hallway. It wasn't a soft noise. It echoed like metal hitting concrete. Roy and I froze. I glanced at him and he looked back at me, not saying a word. I whispered, "Did you hear that?" He nodded. We stood still, waiting for another sound, but it stayed quiet. I felt my heart pounding and I noticed I was holding my breath. I exhaled slowly. Then Roy said, "Might just be something shifting." I wasn't convinced, but we decided to keep going. We placed the empties near the door, ready to cart them out. Then we heard it again, a loud clang like a steel pipe dropping. It was further down the hallway this time. I gripped my flashlight so tight my hand started to sweat. Roy looked uneasy. He leaned out of the room and shone his light toward the corridor, but we saw nothing. I tried to steady my breathing, but it felt like the air in the basement was getting heavier. I told Roy the place was giving me the creeps, and he agreed. He said we should be quick about this and go. We lifted the first oxygen tank and placed it on a dolly. The metal scraped against the floor with a high-pitched screech. At that moment, I felt a sudden draft of cold air pass by my legs. It wasn't a gentle breeze, it was icy and it made my skin prickle. Roy rubbed his arms like he felt it too. We both paused, shining our flashlights around. The corridor was empty. No open windows, no fans running, nothing that could make a breeze. I started to feel a knot forming in my stomach. Roy muttered something about old buildings and weird drafts. We loaded another tank, keeping our eyes on the doorway. I felt my chest tightening, like the basement air was weighing down on me. My uncle moved slower, checking every corner before he set the next tank down. My hands were shaking a bit. When I stood still, I could feel my heart beating against my rib cage. The place was dead quiet, aside from our feet scraping the concrete. We decided to make the first trip upstairs with the cart. The wheels squeaked against the floor as we pushed it. The hallway felt longer now. The flickering lights didn't help my nerves. We had to pass through a narrow section where the lights were completely out. Our flashlights swept across the floor and walls. Rusty pipes, chipped paint, some damp spots. No signs of anyone. But my neck tingled, like I was being watched. When we reached the staircase, we had to lift the cart onto each step. That was annoying and slow, and we kept stumbling. Halfway up, the cart's wheel got stuck on the railing and we had to tilt it. Roy cursed under his breath. We finally made it to the top floor corridor. It was a relief to see some daylight coming through the boarded windows. Not much, but enough to make me feel less claustrophobic. We wheeled the tanks outside and loaded them into Roy's truck. I wiped sweat off my forehead even though it was cold out. The combination of fear and effort had my heart racing. Roy wanted to grab a few more tanks. I said we should maybe just call it a day, but he reminded me we drove 2 hours to get here. We argued a bit, but I gave in. We headed back inside. The main floor seemed a little less intimidating, maybe because we had daylight behind us. But once we started down that staircase again, my stomach got tight. The smell was worse now, like wet concrete and old metal. Every step echoed. Back in the basement, we found the door to the storage room half closed. I remembered leaving it open all the way. I asked Roy if he'd moved it, and he said no. The hair on my arm stood up. I pushed the door open with my foot, shining the flashlight in. The leftover tanks were right where we'd left them. Nothing seemed out of place, aside from the door itself. Roy didn't say anything. He just gave me a quick glance and walked to the tanks. We each lifted one more tank onto the dolly. While I was bent over, I thought I heard something behind me like a slow scrape on the floor. I spun around, shining my light, but saw nothing. My uncle noticed me jump. "You okay?" he asked. My voice came out shaky. "Yeah, just tired." I knew I was lying. I was spooked. We headed out into the hallway again, pushing the cart. About halfway to the stairs, we heard another crash. It sounded like metal clattering on metal, deeper into the basement. My uncle shot me a look. He was sweating. I swallowed hard, then said, "Let's just ignore it and go." We kept moving. My pulse felt like it was hammering in my head. The hallway looked darker than before, or maybe it was just my nerves. Suddenly, something metallic fell far behind us. It echoed loud, like a pipe being thrown onto the floor. We both stopped and turned around, flashlights scanning the corridor. I didn't see anything except scattered junk. A couple of old IV stands, some empty crates. My uncle's breathing was rough. He whispered, "Don't stop. Keep going." We started walking again, faster. But the tension was like a weight on my back. Each step felt heavier. I caught a whiff of something musty, almost like old wet clothes. I coughed, trying to clear my throat. My eyes felt dry. The floor was uneven, and the wheels of the dolly kept rattling. My hands shook so much that I had to tighten my grip. Every few seconds I glanced behind us. When we reached the staircase door, it was closed too. We hadn't shut it when we first came down. Roy tugged the handle and it opened with a loud squeak. He pulled the dolly into the stairwell, then waved for me to follow. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt that icy draft again, blowing right by my face. It made me inhale sharply. Roy felt it too. He paused and pointed his flashlight around the small landing. Nothing. The door slammed shut behind us. The noise shot through me like a jolt. I spun around, but there was no one there. Roy's eyes were wide. I grabbed the dolly and we started hauling the tanks up the steps. The wheels banged against each stair and the noise bounced around the stairwell. My muscles were tired and my forehead was damp with sweat. Roy was breathing hard. We got to the top, pushed open the door to the main level and stepped out. I was relieved to be away from that basement. Even the stale air of the first floor felt better. We rolled the tanks outside again. This time, I didn't want to go back. I told Roy I was done. My hands were shaking and my nerves were shot. Roy agreed. He said we'd seen enough. If the place still had more tanks, he'd come back with someone else another day. Maybe with better lights and more people. I was grateful to hear that. I didn't say another word. We loaded the last tanks into the truck. I slammed the tailgate shut. My uncle didn't talk much, just checked to make sure nothing would slide out. We got in the truck and sat there for a moment. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The hospital looked even more ominous from the outside now, like it was watching us. Roy started the engine, and we drove off. The tires crunched on the gravel, and neither of us spoke for a long time. I kept looking in the side mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the hospital's front doors. But there was no one. Just that empty building and the wind blowing through the trees. My breathing finally slowed as we got farther away, but I was still on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling of something behind me. My arms were tense, and my jaw felt locked. I focused on the road, the sky, and the few houses we passed. I was grateful for any sign of normal life. After a while, Roy cleared his throat and asked if I was all right. I said I was, even though my chest was still tight. He told me he had never heard noises like that in the hospital when it was open. He remembered normal sounds, patients talking, nurses walking around, the hum of lights. But now everything was different. Empty corridors and random bangs in the dark. I tried to block out the memory of that cold draft on my face. We finally reached a small diner on the outskirts of a neighboring town. Roy pulled into the parking lot and we got out to stretch our legs. My knees felt wobbly. I wanted to wash my face, so I went into the restroom. In the mirror, I looked pale with sweat on my forehead. I splashed cold water on my cheeks. The shock of it made me gasp, but it felt good to rinse off the basement's grime. When I came back out, my uncle was standing by the truck. He lit a cigarette and stared at the horizon. He asked if I wanted one, but I said no. He inhaled, then let the smoke out slowly, watching it drift away. I leaned against the truck, feeling the cool metal on my back. The late afternoon sun was low and the sky had that grayish tone you get before dusk. I noticed my heartbeat was still a bit fast. Roy said, "I'm not going back there alone." I just nodded. We stood there for a minute, not saying anything else. We finished our break and climbed back into the truck to head home. The ride was quiet. The road stretched ahead, and I looked at the passing trees. thinking about all the weird stuff that had happened. I still didn't have an explanation for the clanging noises or the door moving on its own. Maybe it was just an old building with faulty ventilation. Maybe someone else had been inside. Or maybe it was something else entirely. I told myself I didn't care. I just wanted to forget the whole thing. At one point, Roy asked me if I felt that weird draft too. I said yeah, and he replied, "That was the strangest part." He shook his head and didn't elaborate. We got back to his place after dark. I helped him unload the tanks into his garage. We didn't talk much, just put them to the side, one by one, setting them against the wall. When we were done, he tossed me a spare rag to wipe my hands. I noticed my fingers were trembling a little. He looked at me and said, "Thanks for the help, but let's never go back there at night." I nodded, feeling a knot in my throat. I climbed into my car, turned on the engine, and let it idle for a moment. Roy gave me a quick wave, and I waved back. As I backed out of his driveway, I felt a surge of relief. I wanted to be far away from that place. My thoughts were still spinning, but I felt safer on that well-lit street. The memory of that cold draft and the loud metal clang stayed with me, though. Even later, when I got home, I found myself double-checking the doors and peeking around corners. It was just an old hospital, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off down there in that basement. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep right away. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured those dark corridors, the weight of the air pressing down on me, that echo of metal crashing somewhere beyond my flashlight's beam. I turned on a small lamp near my bed to chase away the shadows in the room. I told myself it was just my imagination, that everything we heard had a logical explanation, but my body didn't believe it. I was still tense, my shoulders stiff, and my stomach in knots. Eventually, I drifted off, but I kept waking up, half dreaming that I was back in the basement hearing something scrape the floor behind me. Each time I woke, I reminded myself that I was safe at home. No more dark corridors, no more cold drafts. Still, I didn't rest easy. When morning finally came, I felt drained. I grabbed a cup of coffee and stared at the clock, replaying yesterday's events in my head. I don't know what was going on in that hospital basement, and I'm not in a rush to find out. Whatever it was, I hope I never have to deal with it again. Roy told me he might hire a team to clear out the rest of the junk if the hospital owners decide it's worth the trouble. I told him to count me out, and he just nodded. We haven't brought it up since. That basement can keep its secrets. I want nothing more to do with it. I never expected a half-collapsed wooden house to shake me up. But the first time I heard those laughs, my stomach lurched. They sounded playful, like some small person was teasing us. I wasn't sure if it was an echo or something else. My brother and I had just bought this old property on a whim. We thought we got a good deal. The land itself looked promising, and the house, even though it was leaning to one side, came almost free with it. We had planned to tear it down eventually and build something better, but from the moment we set foot inside, I felt off. The air felt stale. The floor felt soft in places. The windows were covered in dust. Everything looked abandoned. Yet that laughter drifted down the staircase, and it set my nerves on edge. I want to talk about that day from the start. We drove in late morning. My brother parked our truck near a cluster of overgrown bushes because the driveway was piled with debris. We grabbed a flashlight, a crowbar, and a few tools to pry open doors or check for rotted beams. When we walked toward the porch, we saw that the house's front steps had shifted to one side, leaving a tilt that made me feel unsteady. The railing felt loose when I gripped it. My brother looked at me with wide eyes, but he forced a grin. We thought it was just a matter of reinforcing some boards, maybe adding new support beams. We weren't worried about anything but structural damage at that point. We went inside through the main door. The hinges creaked loud enough to echo. The interior smelled like mold and old wood. I remember coughing a bit. My brother covered his nose with his sleeve. The living room had a few broken chairs and a sofa with shredded cushions. Everything looked coated in a thin layer of gray dust. The windows were so filthy that the daylight struggled to come through. We took a few steps in, trying not to step on any nails or weak spots. The floors groaned. I stepped on one spot and felt a give. I immediately moved away, and we both decided to watch our footing. I wiped sweat off my forehead. It was warm, but there was also this weird, clammy feeling in the air. While we walked around, we barely spoke. My brother pointed out cracks in the walls. I jotted notes on a small notepad. After a few minutes, we headed to a small side room that might have been a bedroom years ago. The smell was mustier in there, and the walls had dark streaks. It looked like water damage. My brother crouched down to look at the floorboards and asked me to shine the flashlight. I heard him mutter something about the wood rotting. Then we both froze because we heard a soft giggle. It was a short burst of laughter, like someone amused. I felt a pulse of adrenaline in my chest. My brother looked up at me, and I saw the confusion in his eyes. It came from somewhere above us. The sound had a bright tone, like a child's laugh, but we knew there was nobody else here. There were no footprints in the dust on the main floor, no signs of any squatters. The giggle happened again, but it sounded further away, up near the ceiling. My brother stood, and we stared at each other. I felt my arms tense. I asked if he heard it, and he nodded. We both turned our heads toward the open doorway where the hallway led to the staircase. I felt compelled to check. My heart was racing, but curiosity, or maybe just caution, took over. We left that side room and walked back into the hallway. We found the staircase. It was narrow and the steps looked warped. My brother tapped the banister with the crowbar. It felt wobbly. We shone our flashlights upward. Dust swirled in the beams of light. The top of the staircase ended at a small landing. Then there was another door. I guessed it led to a second-floor storage area, or maybe an attic. We started climbing slowly. Each step creaked. My legs felt stiff. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but it was shallow. When we reached the top, we saw a single door cracked open. We pushed it the rest of the way. The hinges whined. Inside, there was an attic space with slanted walls. Cobwebs dangled from the ceiling. The floor was covered with a thick layer of dust. I glanced around, shining the flashlight everywhere. No footprints, no sign of fresh movement. There were a few old boxes in one corner, but they looked untouched for years. The moment we stepped in, the laughter stopped. It didn't fade out, it just cut off. I felt goosebumps on my arms. We stood there for at least a minute, listening. Our breathing sounded loud. No more giggles, no more voices, just a stale silence. My brother took a careful step toward the boxes. He kicked one lightly with his boot, and a puff of dust came out. We checked behind them. Nothing. I noticed a small window on the far side, but it was too dirty to see out. The glass looked cracked. The faint sunlight in there gave everything a dull glow. We called out, but there was no answer. I touched the walls. They felt cold and damp. I reached for the boxes and opened one. It had old newspapers from decades ago. They smelled musty. Some pages were stuck together. Another box had a few broken toys, but they looked ancient. They had that crumbly plastic texture from sitting in heat and cold for years. My brother and I exchanged uneasy glances. We didn't want to hang around longer than we needed. I tried to ignore the strange feeling in my gut, but my skin kept crawling like something was just out of sight. We decided to head back down. We finished the quick inspection on the first floor. Nothing else weird happened for a while. We found a small kitchen with rusted fixtures. We found a bathroom with cracked tiles and a stained tub. We checked a back room that might have been a dining area. All the windows were grimy. Some had broken glass. We saw a door leading to the backyard, but it was stuck. My brother kicked it a few times and it opened. Outside, the grass was up to our knees, and a few old fence posts stuck out of the overgrown weeds. We saw a collapsed shed in the corner. The area felt abandoned and quiet. I heard some buzzing from insects, maybe crickets or flies. We didn't linger too long. We locked up as best we could by jamming the door with a piece of wood. Then we drove back to our apartment. On the way, my brother brought up the laughter. He asked if I thought it was an animal or something else. I shrugged. We both knew it wasn't an animal. It sounded too much like a voice. But I had no explanation. We tried to shake it off. We joked that the house might be haunted, but under the jokes I felt tense. We decided we'd come back with better gear and do a more thorough inspection in a few days. That night I couldn't get the sound out of my head. I slept poorly. I kept seeing that dusty attic in my dreams. The next day we got supplies together. Heavier flashlights, a camera, gloves, and a crowbar each. My brother also suggested we bring some snacks and water in case we stayed longer. We drove out there in late afternoon. We figured if anything was inside, we'd find evidence. Maybe we'd see footprints or droppings or something to explain the noise. We arrived, and the house looked the same. I felt that pang of nervousness as soon as we walked in. We started in the living room again, this time checking the corners and ceiling for any holes that rodents or raccoons might be using. We found nothing but spider webs and some loose boards. We moved from room to room, snapping photos. My brother joked around to keep our spirits up, but his smile looked forced. The place was just creepy. Around sunset, we went outside to check the backyard again. The air felt heavy. The tall grass rustled in a slight breeze. I saw clouds forming in the distance, so maybe a storm was coming. We picked our way through the grass, checking around the collapsed shed. We saw rotted wood planks and some rusted metal barrels. It smelled like wet leaves. Then I heard a rustle in the bushes behind the shed. I turned, expecting maybe a possum, but I saw something move low to the ground. I couldn't get a good look. It darted out of sight. I walked closer, calling out. My brother stood by, shining his flashlight. We both heard that same giggle. It was the exact same laugh, except now it was coming from outside, near the back fence. My breath caught in my throat. It was too dark to see clearly. The sun was going down and the shadows made everything blend together. We advanced slowly. I kept the crowbar ready in my right hand. My hands felt sweaty. My legs felt weak. Then it spoke. At least, it made a sound like speech, but it was garbled. It sounded like a small voice saying something like, "Come on," but drawn out, as if imitating a real person. My brother and I froze. My heart slammed against my chest. I felt a chill on my neck. We scanned the bushes with the flashlight beams. I saw a shape crouched under some thick branches. It was smaller than an adult. It had a hunched posture. The eyes caught the flashlight for a second and shone with a dull reflection. Then it scurried behind a tree trunk. We didn't chase it. We just stood there, trying to make sense of it. My mind was racing, thinking, is that some weird animal? Is it a person messing with us? But it repeated the laugh and it sounded so unnatural. It was like listening to a recording but slightly distorted. My brother took a few steps forward, but I grabbed his shoulder. My gut told me to stay back. Something about it felt wrong. We heard branches crack. We caught a glimpse of that figure moving along the fence line. It moved quickly, almost on all fours. The giggle came again, and my spine felt ice cold. My breathing got faster. My brother whispered that we should leave. I nodded. We started backing away toward the house. It didn't follow us or show itself again, at least not in that moment. We kept looking over our shoulders, scanning the tall grass. The sun had almost set, and everything looked dark. We went back inside the house. It felt safer than being out there, but not by much. We shut the door and slid a heavy piece of wood across it as a makeshift barricade. We decided to wait a bit, let the outside get quiet, then see if we could spot that thing from a window. My hands were shaking. I tore open a water bottle and drank half of it in one gulp. My brother paced around, shining the flashlight at the windows, trying to see through the grime. We heard faint laughter outside again, but it came from farther away. It echoed, then faded. We listened for a long time, but we didn't hear footsteps or any rustling. We peered out a side window, clearing a small patch of dust with our sleeves. The backyard was dark, but the moonlight revealed the shapes of bushes and overgrown grass. We couldn't see movement. The thought of that voice coming from some creature made me feel sick. I wondered if we were dealing with an animal that had learned to mimic sounds, but the tone and the pitch were so human-like. It didn't seem possible. Eventually, we decided we'd had enough. It was night and we didn't want to be stuck there if that thing came back. We opened the front door, carefully stepped onto the porch and scanned the yard. Everything was quiet. We hurried to the truck. While we drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chase us. But the road behind us stayed empty. I felt jittery the entire drive back. Over the next few days, we tried to research if there were any local legends or strange animals known to mimic voices. We found some stories about creatures that can copy sounds, but nothing that matched exactly. We decided to return once more, this time during midday, to see if it was still hanging around. We wanted to take pictures of any tracks or droppings, but part of me dreaded going back. When we arrived that last time, the sun was high. The property felt less threatening, but I still felt uneasy as soon as we stepped out of the truck. The grass in the backyard was trampled in spots. We saw a few impressions in the dirt, but they weren't clear. Could have been from a large dog or something else. We didn't hear laughter that day. We explored around the shed, but there was no sign of a makeshift nest or bedding. The house still looked the same. We went inside to grab a few things we left behind, and we took a handful of pictures to document the condition. Then we locked up and left. I still own that lot with my brother, but I haven't spent the night in that house. We're planning to demolish the structure soon and clear the property. I haven't figured out how to explain the creature we saw or the voice we heard, but I'll never forget how it laughed. It didn't sound natural, and it didn't sound friendly. It was a cold, imitative noise, and every time I think about it, my skin crawls. My brother hasn't talked about it much either, except to say he never wants to be there after dark again. I'm still shaken by the memory. That house was supposed to be a simple investment, a rundown place we could replace with something new. Instead, we stumbled on something I can't explain. Maybe it's just some rare animal. Maybe it's some person messing with us in a strange costume. But I remember those eyes reflecting in the flashlight beam, and I remember how it moved. It didn't move like a normal person. And that voice still echoes in my head sometimes. We heard it upstairs, then again outside. Whatever it is, it knows how to mimic laughter in a way that sounds almost real, but not quite. That's all I know. That's enough to keep me away. I parked my van in front of the house and stared at the two-story structure. The front door was slightly ajar, and the place looked dark, even in daylight. I'd worked on plenty of empty houses before, but something about this one bothered me right away. The porch steps were chipped, and there was a stale odor drifting out into the yard. I felt a small jolt of anxiety in my chest, but I told myself it was just another job. I had my toolbox, my flashlight, and my usual routine. I stepped onto the porch, pushed the door open, and walked in. Inside, the air felt thick. It was cooler than outside, and it had that old wood smell mixed with something sour. My boots made a dull thud on the floor. The hallway stretched ahead, and stairs led up to the second floor on the right. I set my toolbox down for a moment and looked around. There wasn't much furniture. The walls were a dull beige, and the light fixtures were outdated. I thought it would be a straightforward inspection. Check the wiring, note any faulty outlets, and make sure the breaker box was labeled correctly. That was the plan. I picked up my toolbox and moved down the hallway. The floor creaked under my weight, and I could hear my own breathing. Every noise seemed louder than usual. I felt like someone was behind me, so I stopped and glanced over my shoulder. The corridor behind me was empty, and all I heard was my heartbeat. I shook it off. Houses settle and make weird sounds all the time, especially older ones. I kept going. The first room on the left was a small living room. The windows were closed, and the curtains were drawn. Dust floated in the air, visible in the thin light that slipped through a gap in the curtain. I flicked the wall switch, but no light came on. I walked over to the lamp in the corner, plugged into an outlet near the couch. I pulled out my voltage tester to see if there was any current. Nothing. I crouched down to remove the outlet cover. My hand felt unsteady, so I paused. I realized I was just nervous for no reason. I started unscrewing the cover, wiggling wires and checking connections. As I worked, I felt a gust of air on the back of my neck. The windows were shut. There was no fan. I turned around fast, half expecting to see someone there, but the room was still empty. I heard a faint rustling sound near the doorway, like clothing brushing against the wall. But I didn't see anything. My stomach tightened. I pressed my lips together and tried to focus on the wires. After a few minutes, I reattached the cover and tested the outlet. It worked. I stood up and exhaled, relieved that my mind had probably been playing tricks on me. I moved down the hall to the kitchen. The tile floor was grimy and the overhead light flickered for a second when I flipped the switch. It died out immediately. I set my toolbox on the counter and opened the breaker panel in a nearby closet. Most of the breakers were labeled, though the handwriting was faint. As I checked each breaker, I thought I heard a thud upstairs. I paused and listened. It was quiet again. I turned back to the breaker box, feeling my face get warm. I wanted to finish quickly. I reset a couple of breakers, hoping the overhead light would stay on. It didn't. I closed the panel and decided to check the wiring in the fixture above the kitchen table. The table was gone. Only a few scratches on the floor showed where it used to sit. I grabbed a step stool from my van earlier, so I went to get it. As I walked back through the hallway, I heard a soft clicking sound behind me. It reminded me of fingernails tapping wood. My heart started pounding, and my palms got sweaty. I looked over my shoulder. Nothing. But I felt that same cold sensation on my neck, like someone was standing too close. I hurried back to the kitchen, trying not to think about it. I set up the stool under the light fixture. I climbed up and removed the glass cover. The inside was dusty, and a dead moth fell onto the counter. I tested the wires with my meter. The reading was inconsistent. I needed to replace part of the connection. It wasn't dangerous, but it wouldn't pass an inspection. I rummaged through my toolbox for a small connector. When I straightened up again, I heard a creak in the hallway. It wasn't a random house noise. It was footsteps. I froze on the stool, barely breathing. The steps sounded like they were moving closer. I thought maybe it was the client, but they told me nobody else would be here. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned my head toward the doorway. I didn't see anyone. The footsteps stopped. I stood there for a few seconds, straining my ears. The only sound was the hum of my flashlight, which I'd left on the counter. My legs felt weak, but I went back to work. I reconnected the wires, tested them, and slid the fixture cover back on. I climbed down and packed up my tools. I caught my reflection in the window over the sink. My face looked pale, and my eyes darted around. I was on edge, and I knew I needed to finish as soon as possible. Next, I headed upstairs. The steps were narrow and the railing was loose. Each step groaned under me. The second-floor hallway was darker than the first floor. The windows up here were all covered with old blinds, and barely any light made it through. I used my flashlight to see where I was going. The doors to the rooms were closed except for one at the end of the hallway. I started with the closest door on the right. It was a small bedroom, empty except for a bare mattress leaning against the wall. The overhead light was missing, just some exposed wires hanging from the ceiling. I noted that down on my clipboard. I was about to step out when I heard a shuffle in the corner. It sounded like fabric dragging across the floor. My heart felt like it was going to burst. I shone my flashlight around. I saw nothing but peeling wallpaper in that old mattress. My breathing was uneven, and my mouth felt dry. I told myself I might be hearing my own clothes brushing against something. But I wasn't sure. I left the bedroom and moved to the next door on the left. I opened it carefully. It was a bathroom. The sink was cracked, and the mirror was missing. A few broken tiles were scattered on the floor. I switched on the light, and surprisingly, it worked. It flickered but stayed on. I glanced at the old tub and saw a few dark stains. I didn't want to think about it. I tested the outlet near the sink. It was fine. I turned off the light and left. As I stood in the hallway, I felt lightheaded. The place smelled musty and I was sweating under my work shirt. I heard another sound behind me, like a faint whisper. My stomach knotted up. I spun around, shining the flashlight along the corridor. No one was there, but I could swear I saw a quick movement by the stairs. I took a few steps closer, aimed my flashlight down the stairs, and saw only the dark living room below. I cursed under my breath. I just wanted to get this over with. The last room was at the end of the hall. The door was slightly open and I saw a bit of daylight through the gap. I pushed it open fully and stepped inside. It was probably the master bedroom once. There was a wide window on the far wall with blinds half broken. The floor was covered in dust. A single floor lamp stood in one corner, unplugged. I checked the outlet next to the window. It had no power. I went to the other side of the room and tried that outlet. It was fine. I walked to the lamp and lifted the cord. The prongs were bent. I put it down and made a quick note. My flashlight beam landed on the closet door. It was closed. I hesitated. I didn't want to open it, but I needed to be thorough. I approached it slowly and reached for the knob. My hand was shaking. I gripped the knob, turned it, and pulled the door open. Inside, it was dark and empty. A single wire ran from the ceiling to a bare bulb socket. No bulb, just a socket. I poked my head in, tested the wire with my meter, and confirmed it was dead. As I backed out, I smelled something foul, like old, wet laundry. I tried not to breathe through my nose. Suddenly, I heard a scraping sound in the hallway, like a heavy object dragged across the floor. I whipped my head around and aimed my flashlight at the open door of the bedroom. My pulse hammered in my ears. I stepped out into the hallway again, shining light around. The air felt even colder. I noticed a slight movement in my peripheral vision. It looked like a shadow gliding along the wall. I turned my head fast, but it was gone. My hands started to tremble. I had goosebumps all over my arms. I wanted to run, but I forced myself to check the last bit of wiring near the stairs. That was the last task I had before I could leave. I walked back to the top of the stairs. There was a small access panel in the wall that I needed to open to check some junctions. My flashlight wavered as I held it between my chin and shoulder, trying to unscrew the panel. The screws fell to the floor, and I bent down to pick them up. That's when I felt someone pass behind me, close enough that the air shifted against my back. My entire body froze. I felt my hair stand on end. My scalp tingled. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I turned around in a panic, shining the flashlight everywhere. The hallway was empty. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the panel back into place without finishing the inspection. My hands were shaking too much. I tucked my screwdriver into my belt and hurried down the stairs. I almost stumbled on the last step, but I caught myself on the railing. I rushed down the hallway, my eyes jumping from corner to corner. The front door was still open, letting in a sliver of daylight. I grabbed my toolbox and nearly ran outside. Once I was on the porch, I took a deep breath. The air outside felt warm and fresh compared to inside. My hands were slick with sweat, and my heartbeat thudded in my ears. I went straight to my van and tossed the toolbox into the passenger seat. I slammed the door and locked it. My mouth was dry and my throat felt tight. I started the engine and glanced back at the house. The front door was still hanging open. For a second, I thought I saw a figure standing just inside the doorway, but when I blinked, there was nothing. I shifted into drive and pulled away, my tires crunching against the gravel. As I drove off, I tried to catch my breath. I felt a dull ache in my chest, a leftover tension. My fingers still gripped the steering wheel too tightly. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something behind the van, but the street was empty. When I turned the corner, I let out a long sigh. I told myself it was just an old house with bad wiring and some weird noises. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there with me the whole time, staying out of sight. When I got back to the shop, I filled out the paperwork. I wrote down my notes. A few outlets needed updating. A fixture in the kitchen needed a new connector. The breaker box labels needed to be replaced. I left out the strange details. No point telling anyone about shadows or footsteps. They'd assume I was jumpy or making it up. I just wanted to finish the report, send it off, and avoid that house in the future. I still remember the chill on my neck and the feeling of movement just behind me. My skin crawls thinking about it. The job was done, but I couldn't get the place out of my head. I tried to focus on the technical stuff, the wiring, the outlets, the flickering lights. But that uneasy feeling stuck with me for the rest of the day. I found myself turning around in my own workshop, half expecting someone to be behind me. It took a while for the tension to fade. By the next morning, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just the silence of that place. Maybe the house was settling more than usual. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't describe it in logical terms. There was something off in that house, and it hovered around me the entire time I was there. I still get a knot in my stomach when I think about it. If anyone ever calls me to go back there, I'm not sure I could handle it again. Even now, I sometimes wake up at night thinking I hear those same slow footsteps just outside my bedroom door. Then I realize it's just my heart pounding. And I remember that empty house, the shadows, and the uneasy feeling that wouldn't go away. I hope I never have to set foot in that place again. I never expected to find something so unsettling in a place I thought I knew inside and out. I've worked in an antique jewelry store for years, handling ornate pieces from old estates and private collections. I've seen rings with strange carvings, necklaces with odd designs, and all sorts of unique pendants. Nothing ever got under my skin. Nothing made me feel off. But that changed the night I stayed late and found a ring we hadn't cataloged. I want to lay out everything that happened, step by step, because it still makes me uneasy to think about it. I was in the back room of the shop around 8 at night. The store had closed an hour earlier, and I planned to do a final count of the day's sales. Normally, I check the showcases, lock up, set the alarm, and leave. That night, though, I realized I hadn't taken a decent look at our safe in a while. We keep old pieces there that aren't on display yet. Sometimes new shipments or consigned items arrive, and we store them in the safe until we have time to prepare them. I remembered a new batch had come in earlier that week, and I wanted to see if everything was in order. I switched on the bright fluorescent light in the back room. The safe is a big metal cabinet with reinforced locks. It's old-fashioned, but it's got a modern security system attached. I turned the dial, entered the code, and pulled the heavy door open. Inside were a few velvet pouches, some stacked trays, and a small wooden box that I didn't recognize. Most of our items are stored in plain containers or standard jewelry boxes. That wooden box looked handmade. It was rough and unmarked. I picked it up and felt its weight. It wasn't heavy, but there was something about it that felt out of place. I set the box on the counter and opened the lid. Inside, I found a single ring resting on a dark cloth. The ring was silver-colored, though I couldn't immediately tell if it was pure silver or some other metal. It had a strange symbol carved on the band. It looked like a circle with lines cutting through it. I couldn't decide if it was a letter from another alphabet or just a decorative design. It didn't match any style I'd seen in our usual pieces, and I've seen a lot of odd things pass through. I just stood there for a moment, confused about where it came from and why it wasn't logged in our inventory. I decided to examine it more closely, so I grabbed my loupe. We have a special magnifier that has an adjustable light to see fine details. I turned on the lamp above the counter and lifted the ring to the lens. Right away, I noticed tiny etchings that circled the band. They looked like patterns, but I couldn't decipher them. Then I saw a faint mark that could have been some maker's stamp. While I was focusing on that, I felt a sudden jab in my temples. It was like a sharp pain that came out of nowhere. My vision blurred for a split second, and my stomach did a flip. I put the ring down and rubbed my eyes, trying to clear my head. I've had headaches before, but this one was different. It came on fast and then disappeared. A rush of discomfort spread across my neck and shoulders. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. even though the back room is usually cool. I tried to brush it off. I assumed I was tired or hungry. But then, while I was blinking and trying to steady myself, a quick image flashed in my mind. It was dark, like I was in some large hall or underground chamber. The walls seemed to glow with torchlight. I couldn't see any people, but I heard voices chanting. It was just a second of that sensation, but it made my pulse hammer. I shook my head and tried to focus on the ring again. I thought maybe the stress was messing with me. I put the ring back in the box, closed the lid, and returned it to the safe. I double-checked the lock, grabbed my things, and left the store in a hurry. I didn't mention anything to my coworkers or my boss the next day because I felt foolish talking about a random vision. That night, I went to bed around 11. I fell asleep pretty fast, but I woke up at exactly midnight with a pounding in my chest. My room was dark, but I noticed a faint glow in my bag, which I'd left on a chair. At first, I thought maybe my phone was lighting up from a notification. I got up to check, and I realized the glow was coming from that wooden box. I had brought it home by accident. I guess I was so disoriented when I left the shop that I must have slipped it into my bag without thinking. I unzipped the bag, and the box had a pale light seeping through the cracks. I felt a wave of confusion. I was wide awake, my hands were shaky, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The box vibrated lightly, like something inside was moving or resonating. I opened the lid, and the ring itself had a dim glow. It pulsed, flickering like a weak LED. Then I heard a whisper. It wasn't loud, and I couldn't make out words at first. It was more like a hiss asking me to pick up the ring and wear it. I couldn't figure out if I was hearing something real or if it was in my head. My mouth went dry. My stomach felt tight, and I had a buzzing sensation in my arms and legs. I didn't put the ring on. I just slammed the box shut and shoved it to the back of my closet. Then I stood there, in the dark, wondering if I was going crazy. My pulse took a while to calm down, and my clothes were sticking to me from sweat. I tried to lie down, but I couldn't fall back asleep for an hour. When I finally dozed off, I dreamt of that dark hall again, torches on the walls and voices chanting. This time I felt like I was walking down the center aisle, moving toward a stone platform. I still couldn't see who was chanting. It was like a crowd of invisible people surrounding me. The next morning I woke up exhausted. I checked my closet, half expecting to see some evidence that it was a dream, but the box was still there. I left it alone, went to work, and pretended everything was fine. I told myself I would return the ring to the safe. But as the day went on, I kept feeling that same pressure in my head. It was mild, but it lingered. Around noon, I even felt a slight vibration in my pocket, like a phone call, except my phone wasn't vibrating at all. I felt off all day. When I got back home that evening, I opened the closet and took out the box. It wasn't glowing. It looked normal, just a plain wooden container with a ring inside. I decided to do a quick online search for the symbol I saw on the band. I found some references to old cults and secret societies, but nothing conclusive. Everything seemed vague. I didn't find a clear match. I started thinking about bringing it to a specialist. We sometimes consult with experts on unique pieces, but this felt more personal. I ended up sitting there staring at the box for a while. My mind was all over the place. I finally went to bed, but I kept the box on my nightstand, as if I was daring it to do something. At midnight it glowed again. The ring's pulsing light reflected on the walls. My chest felt tight. My breathing turned shallow, and I heard the whispers a bit louder this time. They said, "Wear it. Join us. Complete the ritual." I backed away and I almost fell off the bed. My heart hammered so hard that I felt nauseous. I grabbed the box, closed it, and stuffed it into a drawer. My hands were trembling the whole time. I felt sweat dripping down my neck. I tried to calm down by focusing on the hum of my bedside lamp. I was telling myself, it's just an old ring. It can't do anything by itself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was urging me, pushing me to do something I didn't understand. I didn't sleep well that night either. Over the next few days, the same pattern repeated. Each night, exactly at midnight, The ring glowed and whispered. Sometimes it spoke clearer words, like it was gaining strength. Other times it just made hissing sounds, and I felt a strong impulse to put it on. I resisted every time. My body felt stiff, and my forehead broke out in sweat. I could feel a pounding in my ears like a slow drum beat. During the day, I couldn't focus at work. I kept thinking about the ring. I'd feel random pulses of pressure in my head, like an echo of what happened at night. I got the sense it was leading me somewhere or preparing me for something. I'd see glimpses of that dark hall in my mind. I'd see flickers of a large circular design on the floor. I tried to distract myself with everyday tasks. I tried to ignore the weird physical sensations. I drank more coffee to stay alert. I avoided the back room at the store as much as possible, but I couldn't escape the feeling that the ring was calling me. One afternoon, I reached my limit. I decided I would bring the ring back to the store's safe and lock it away. Maybe that would break this weird connection. Around 6 in the evening, when the store was empty, I retrieved the box from my bag. I carried it to the back room and put it on the counter. I opened it to take one last look at the ring before locking it away. It felt heavier in my hand this time, or maybe I was just more nervous. My palms were sweating. My shoulders felt tense. I placed it in the safe and shut the door. I even said out loud, "Stay in there." I felt ridiculous talking to an object, but I hoped it would help me calm down. That night I stayed at the store until closing again. I was worried that if I went home, I'd wake up to find the ring glowing in my room. So I made sure it was locked away and walked out at 8. I got to my apartment, ate a quick dinner, and tried to watch TV. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down to midnight. At exactly 12, I felt that pressure in my temples again. My eyes darted around the living room, expecting to see a glow, but there was nothing. My chest still felt heavy, and I heard a faint whisper in the back of my head. It sounded angry, like it was frustrated I wasn't near the ring. I managed to get a decent night's sleep. The next morning I felt relieved. I thought maybe that was it, that locking the ring in the safe had broken the link. But when I got to the store, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The alarm panel was going haywire. The motion sensors had been triggered during the night, but there were no signs of a break-in. I walked to the back room to check on the safe. The door was still locked, but I sensed something off. When I spun the dial and entered the code, I found the ring out of its box, resting on top of the velvet pouch. The wooden box was there, wide open. I swallowed hard, and a cold sweat formed on my forehead. It made no sense. Nobody else had the combination, and there were no marks on the safe. The ring seemed to be in the same position it was in my nightmares, like it was waiting for me. I stood there, staring at it. My legs felt shaky. My throat was dry. I forced myself to pick it up again and put it back in the box. The moment I touched it, I felt that stabbing headache behind my eyes. I closed the box, locked the safe, and tried to go about my day. The entire time, I felt drained, like I hadn't slept in weeks. That night, I didn't want to risk anything else. I took the ring out of the safe, placed it back in the wooden box, and carried it to my car. I drove around, unsure of where to go. My hands were tight on the steering wheel and my heart pounded every time I felt the box shift on the passenger seat. I ended up parking in an empty lot behind a row of warehouses. I just sat there with the engine off, staring at the box, feeling waves of nausea and dread. I opened the box. The ring started to glow right away, even though it was only about 10 at night. The whispers were there, telling me to put it on, telling me there was no point in resisting, telling me I was close to fulfilling something. My ears felt hot. My forehead was damp. My chest felt like it was caving in. I couldn't think straight. I wanted to throw it out the window and drive away, but it was like my hand froze. I couldn't make myself drop the ring. I forced my eyes away from it, slammed the box shut, and started the car. I drove back to my apartment and left the box in the trunk. I didn't want it in my home again. Of course, at midnight, I felt the throbbing in my temples and heard the whispers in my head, muffled but persistent. I tossed and turned in bed, half expecting the ring to appear on my nightstand again. By morning, I was on edge. My shoulders ached, and my eyes were bloodshot. I had that strange sense that the ring was demanding I follow through on something. It wanted me to join a ritual in some hidden place, and every vision I had of that dark hall pushed me closer to panic. I still don't know what that ritual is. Maybe it's some ceremony that was never completed. Maybe the ring is a key to something. I can't get that image of the stone platform out of my mind. It feels like a real place that I might find if I kept digging in old records or if I drove far enough into the countryside looking for ruins. I haven't told anyone at work about this in detail. I said we got an odd piece that gives me headaches, but nothing more. I keep it locked up now, though I don't trust that it will stay put. Every night at midnight I feel its pull. The throbbing in my head, the whispers, the faint glow in the corners of my vision. It wants me to wear it. It wants me to step into that torchlit hall. It wants me to stand before that platform and finish what others started, but I don't know what that is. I'm still resisting. I'm still trying to figure out if there's a logical explanation. I have no proof of anything supernatural, but the physical sensations are real. My racing heart, my sweaty palms, the shortness of breath, the sudden headaches. The sense of being watched or guided is impossible to ignore. I don't know how long I can keep this up. Sometimes I think about just throwing the ring in a river, but I get a feeling that it will find its way back. For now, I live with it. Every midnight I tense up. Every day I pretend things are normal. But I can't forget the chanting in that hall. I can't forget the ring's glow or the whispers telling me to complete a ritual. I don't know where it leads, and I don't know if I'll ever understand, but I'm stuck with this piece of old metal and its strange symbol, and I'm caught in something that I never asked for. That's the truth of it, as plainly as I can tell it. And even as I finish this, I feel the ring's weight pulling at my thoughts, urging me to pick it up one more time. I haven't given in yet, but I feel like it's only a matter of time before something changes, and I don't know what will happen when that moment comes.